When Ryuji arrived back at the magic shop, he could hear the distinct boiling sizzle pop of eggs being cooked in bacon grease. He locked the door and made his way to the back, where he displayed his treasure with a grin that was mirrored by the old dwarf. The moment was broken by a tufting sound that turned out to be the magic of the fire giving out. The old dwarf then spent the next couple of minutes explaining the feeling of mana in one's body. Once his explanation was over, he looked at Ryuji and told him to put his hand into the basin under the glowing magic circle. He explained that the magic circle would draw his mana and that would be the perfect time to try moving his mana around. Once he felt it, he would be able to tell what it felt like and could then try using it to fill the stove's enchantment. Ryuji cautiously stuck his hand into the space inside the basin under the faintly glowing orange magic circle. The next moment, he felt a sensation unlike any he had ever felt in his life. It was as if something was sucking the very heat from his hand, but he didn't feel cold. It also kind of tingled, but there was no sensation that it was coming from his nerves. It suddenly dawned on him that there was something there that was feeling this sensation, and it wasn't his body. He began exploring this strange feeling and found that it extended throughout his whole body. He also, now that he knew what he was looking for, could tell how to feel and move that strange something. He could tell that this thing in him was almost like a fluid, but it moved like a thick fluid, cold syrup perhaps. The sensation in his hand was like something was melting that almost frozen syrup and drawing it into a flame or into a vacuum. He concentrated on the feeling of the melting and tried to apply it to the area of his entire arm. Suddenly the flame in the stove came back and the old dwarf wizard chuckled, but to Ryuji's ears, it sounded almost derisive. Ryuji concentrated on that feeling and tried to move it to his whole body. At first, he had no luck, but then he began to almost see an image of himself in blue, with ripples forming on his surface. He concentrated on making all the rippled spread to all parts of his body, but not letting them reach his arm. Once the ripples had spread all over the rest of his body, he opened the last area and pushed the whole lot toward his hand all at once. He lost his concentration from two things. First, the old dwarf screeching, and the second was the actual burning sensation on the skin around his arm. When he opened his eyes, the flame was roaring out from under the stove and around the edge of the cooktop. He pulled his hand back and checked his arm to make sure that the skin wasn't burned. Once he confirmed that, he looked at the stove and realized that the fire would burn the eggs. While the dwarf was fiddling with the magic area of the stove, he began flipping the eggs. Once the whole ordeal was over, they shared a hearty laugh before the dwarf spoke. "See if I underestimate ye again. I thought you were okay when you got the fire tall light, but ye have a bit more control o' your mana than I gave you credit fair. I be wonderin' just how much o' your mana did ye tap into? Did ye get the feelin' o' butter meltin' out of ye?" The old dwarf had a strange way of describing the sensation, but it was understandable. "I probably only got to about 5% of my mana." The strange look the dwarf gave him told him that either he had no idea what he was saying or that he couldn't believe him, so he tried again. "I think I only got 1 part in 20 of my mana." Suddenly, the dwarf changed his look from unsure to downright disbelieving, and the change was such that Ryuji could now easily tell the difference. "Ye think ye got that much mana, do ye? How did ye come ta that amount then? Knowin' yer level of mana like that is a skill that ye shouldna have yet. Tell me what ye saw or felt that made ye feel that way." As Ryuji told the old dwarf about the way he saw his mana as a blue liquid form of his body, the old dwarf continued to cook. They both finished about the same time and the old guy slapped his back with a grin. "Well, rust me toes. You got a better feel for mana than I did after a year o' practice. And I'll be a goblin if you don't have the most mana of anybody I ever met, beside myself that is." They then had a nice chat over a very hearty breakfast. Ryuji liked the sweetbread, but this was so much better. During their chat, several topics came up for discussion. The first thing that Ryuji asked was what his new teacher's name was. It moved through an explanation of his past and went through a bunch of the old guy's past exploits in wizardry, which Ryuji couldn't get enough of. As they were wrapping up breakfast, Dorn, the dwarf teacher, told Ryuji that he had all but given up on ever finding anybody whom he could pass his knowledge along to. Ryuji then got a first-hand demonstration of the 3 types of magic known in the world. The first one Dorn demonstrates is the type that he's proficient in, caster magic. In that type of magic, a person calls upon one of the 6 elements, air, dark, earth, fire, light, or water. They then infuse mana into a powder or solution of that element and draw a magic circle describing a spell. Once the spell is complete, the mana uses the power of the element or elements invoked to perform the actions described by the magic circle. He demonstrated this by dipping his finger into a powder of coal and infusing his mana into it. He then drew a small glowing orange circle in the air, with a triangle and several symbols in it. As soon as he finished, the circle flared into a flame, and when Dorn snapped his fingers, a small flame appeared on his fingertips. It followed them around until he closed his hand and the flame disappeared. Dorn then told Ryuji about a type of magic that he could use, but not very well. Summoning magic used the same general principles, but slightly different, and the end result was wholly different. He described the method a summoner would use to summon creatures to do their bidding. The summoner had to have a bit of that type of animal and would then make a magic circle by infusing mana into that. The description in the magic circle described the attributes and binding of the creature so that it would obey the summoner. Dorn then searched around until he found a vial of white powder that he told Ryuji was the powdered bone of a rabbit. He dipped his finger in it like before and drew a glowing green magic circle in the air. When he finished, a rabbit fell out of thin air and hit the floor running. It dashed all around the shop and knocked several things over before Ryuji could get the door open. The moment it saw an opening, it bolted out the door and down the street with Dorn cursing it the whole time. Dorn then tried explaining the 3rd type of magic to Ryuji, who was doing his best not to laugh. Dorn eyed him sidelong and began to chuckle. Before long they were both rolling with laughter about the successfully failed summon. After a time, the 2 noticed a 3rd person in the shop, and the young gentleman, a regular at the magic shop, was left bewildered at the never-before-seen sight of Dorn laughing. This prompted him to cast speculative glances toward Ryuji, but he never spoke a word to him. After concluding his business, Dorn began explaining the 3rd magic type in earnest. He told Ryuji that enchanting was the magic that made objects with a purpose perform that purpose, with mana being supplied instead of effort. He explained that movement was the most commonly used enchantment right after mana storage. In enchanting, the enchanter would carve or mold a magic circle on a common item and have it invoke that item's normal function. The item would then perform its function anytime mana was supplied. Ryuji marveled at how much this was all so much like a manga. Each of the different types of magic were things Ryuji had read and dreamed about in manga his whole life. Dorn demonstrated this the 2nd time that day, with a different tool than the stove. He pulled out a small wooden wheel and used a knife to carve a magic circle into the soft wood of the wheel. The circle was very uncomplicated in its design, and when he supplied it with mana, it began to roll. It rolled at a leisurely pace across the room, but stopped before it reached the other side of the room. As Dorn was explaining all the things that are used in casting magic, Ryuji was awestruck. The largest portion of the things used to cast magic were rocks that have to be ground down. He began to realize just how important his limited knowledge of chemistry and geology was to his future success as a wizard. He then thought that perhaps he should write some of his past knowledge down before he forgot it all. As he was thinking about that, it led him to the thought that he needed a notebook to write things in. While he was at it, he decided a complete set of magic casting tools would be good to have, and he started making mental notes about all of the things he might need. After a few minutes of compiling mental notes between Dorn's tidbits of lessons, Ryuji started to think of all the things that he needed besides magic supplies. As soon as he did, he remembered his date and started to panic because the time got away from him. He then had to wait impatiently for the next break in Dorn's less-than-linear lecture to tell him about his other plans for the evening. After a moment, Dorn paused to consider the best way to explain something, and Ryuji had to interrupt. Excuse me for a moment. I just remembered that at noon, I mean midday, I need to go back to the inn. The waitress agreed to show me around town so that I could get necessities. I could really use a change of clothes so I can wash these. Dorn considered the elf for a moment, then looked at the windowsill. The shadows on the windowsill were straight down and Dorn looked back at Ryuji. He chuckled for a moment as he shook his hand in a shooing motion. Best get ye gone then, lad. No lesson I can teach ye is ever going to be as interestin' as love. As he finished speaking, Dorn gave another chuckle that soon turned into a roaring laugh. Ryuji could only smile and bow. But as he went to rush out the door, Dorn threw one last demand at him. Just be sure ye come back, eh? I don't want to have to go lookin' for ye later. Ryuji smiled as he bowed again and rushed out. Strictly speaking, Ryuji knew he wasn't expected until after midday, but he did want to do a couple things to make himself more presentable for his date with Karen. With that in mind, he made his way to the market. He had in mind to buy one thing, soap. He ended up getting a little bit more than that as usual. From there he went to the front gate and then from there around to the river where he could wash. He knew he wouldn't have time to wash himself off and he certainly couldn't wait for clothes to dry out. He wasn't there for either of those things at this time. What he did intend to do was wash his hair and he was pretty sure that it would be dry by the time he went on his date. After a few moments, his hair felt ever so much cleaner, as though it hadn't been washed in weeks. With that out of the way, he stowed his soap in one of the rags he had bought and used on his hair, then shoved it all into his satchel. From one of the pockets, he produced the cologne and splashed a little bit on another rag that he then vigorously rubbed all over his shirt and pants before putting them back. He had bought the biggest satchel the old cat had. It wasn't a particularly nice color, just leather brown, but it was plenty big. It also featured 3 small pouches that hid under the fold-over top. With this, he should be able to get all his clothing and anything else he needed. He continued thinking of logistical issues until he reached the front of the inn. No sooner did he walk up than he almost bumped into a gorgeous woman in an off-white dress. She was just making her way out of the inn and he wondered what such a beautiful woman would be doing in a place like this. He had just opened his mouth to apologize when she turned to him and recognition dawned on him. The vision standing in front of him was none other than Karen, wearing the dress that the innkeeper had lent her. He was struck speechless and just stood there with his mouth hanging open. Karen looked like she wanted to say something but blushed and turned her head to the side. She then struck a bashful pose with her hands clasped behind her back, which in turn thrust her now very visible cleavage out toward Ryuji. If he could have burst a nosebleed like an anime character, this would have been the time. Ryuji tried to recover from his stupor, but only with limited success. Karen, you wow. You look absolutely stunning. What's the occasion? Karen's head snapped around to look at him with an indignant look on her face only to see him wearing his usual charming, teasing smile. She blushed even deeper, but this time with anger. I'll have you know that this dress isn't very comfortable, so you better appreciate the effort it took for me to wear it. His grin just got bigger, and she was about to say something else when she noticed the wondrous scent that was coming from him. He was still wearing the same clothing, but that was the point of her showing him where the tailor was. Still, she couldn't help herself and breathed in a huge breath through her nose. A smile spread across her face as she savored the scent until she realized what she had just done and turned around flustered. She tried to hide her face in her hands out of embarrassment. Ryuji smiled at the adorable reactions from Karen before speaking in a calm and level voice. Shall we get going? Oh, before I forget. I got you something that I thought you might like and now I'm more convinced than ever. As Karen turned to look back at him, Ryuji pulled the intricate glass bottle of perfume from his satchel and held it out to her. At first, she wasn't sure what it was. Then realization dawned on her and her jaw dropped and her eyes opened wide in surprise. This is for me? But wasn't this expensive? You don't have to treat me like some noble lady, you know. I'm just a commoner. Even though I can tell that you aren't, you still don't have to treat me like I'm ahead of my station. Ryuji was caught off guard by her words and it left him a little dazed. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I don't even remember my past, so I couldn't say what I would treat a noble woman like, but I don't think I would mind giving you the same. I guess I did find out that I'm supposed to be a noble while I was at the Mercenaries Guild yesterday. At those words, Karen turned her face away and she looked like she wanted to cry. The only thing that I have that gives me any clue about my past is this. He held his pendant slightly out of his shirt. The problem is, it was broken or something because all the documents were in a foreign language that the guild employee didn't even recognize. As he dropped the pendant back inside his shirt, Ryuji reflected on the fact that all of that was technically true, even if he was leaving large parts about it out. Karen considered that for a moment, then smiled up at him. She seemed to feel a little better and more relaxed, then she reached out and grabbed his hand. Well then, come on my lord. Let's get you some clothes and stuff. Karen was pulling on his arm with a big happy smile, and then suddenly she looked panic-stricken. Oh no. I almost forgot to get your money. I'll be right back. As she dashed back inside, Ryuji imagined what spending his life with her would be like. A small house with a garden? No, he was going to become a wizard, so that would mean a small shop somewhere in some small town or village. He could imagine her being a good mother, both gentle and kind. He wondered if he did settle down like that with her, would his noble past come looking for him? Ryuji was just beginning to think about children when a very flustered Karen came bursting back out of the inn with a heavy satchel strap digging into her shoulder. Ryuji reached out and grabbed the satchel off her shoulder, and she looked embarrassed and bowed, saying, Sorry, I wasn't trying to keep your coins, my lord." Suddenly Ryuji felt bad about taking the bag, and he felt paranoid about being called lord, so he glanced around to make sure no one was in earshot. "No, that's not it. It just looked really heavy, and you look much too beautiful to be carrying something so drab. One thing though, please don't call me my lord or anything like that. I don't remember being a noble, and it just doesn't feel right somehow. I just want you to enjoy our little trip, so I'll try not to treat you like a noble either, but it's going to be hard as gorgeous as you are." Karen blushed even deeper and turned around. She managed to squeak out a thank you before heading in the direction of the money changer. Her main goal was to keep Ryuji from seeing the undignified look on her face. From the moment she walked out and got a good look at him in the light, she had been having lewd thoughts about the things she would like to do to him and things she would like him to do to her. She couldn't help herself, he looked so good. His hair was blowing in the breeze and his light skin looked so fine and smooth that she just wanted to rub all over him. Then she caught a whiff of his obviously expensive cologne and she suddenly couldn't contain her excitement. It was going to be hard walking around with him for hours without hanging all over him, she thought to herself. In only a few minutes of walking, they arrive at the money changer. Ryuji was a little flustered that he didn't get to walk beside Karen and perhaps hold her hand. Every time he tried to get next to her, she would walk faster, and in the brief glimpses he got of her face he could tell she was blushing. He appreciated that she was embarrassed, but he still would have liked to talk to her. It turned out that the money changer was only just across the river from the Mercenaries Guild. The front of the building was very auspicious to the point of being gaudy. If anyone had simply said, "Look for the building that is painted like a bag of gold," he could have found it easily enough. It was practically an eyesore. With an exterior like this, he dreaded the interior. Ryuji's fears were, fortunately, unfounded, as the interior of the money changers was quite refined. There were a few couches, little more than padded benches, for people to sit on. There were a few potted shrubs in the waiting area and a few paintings on the walls, and then there were the desks. Instead of a single long counter as he had expected, there were numerous ornate desks, each with a clerk sitting at them. Each desk reflected the personality of the occupant, but all were rather tasteful. Ryuji made his way over to one of the desks while Karen opted to wait on one of the couches. Most of the people behind the desks were already helping people, but he found a couple, towards the back, that were as yet unfilled. After seating himself, the young man at the desk looked at him with a big smile on a somewhat homely and pimply teenage face before asking if he could help him. Ryuji proceeded to drop the heavy satchel full of copper onto the desk and asked for most of it in large silver, but with several small silver and large copper in the mix. The clerk looked at the satchel of coins for only a second before throwing out a retort. "So you want the usual for a storefront, not for a shopping spree?" When Ryuji inquired about the difference, the young man told him that the storefront mix favored smaller coinage to provide change to customers, while the shopping mix favored larger coins to cover purchases in one go and get change back. Obviously, Ryuji went with the second proposal. After thanking the young man named Shone Moneyhand, who Ryuji was quick to commit to memory since he was likely to be seeing a lot of him, he got up from the desk. He left him with a large copper tip and picked up Karen on the way out. It was time to really begin their date. Also, Ryuji began considering how he was going to keep explaining away the huge numbers of small copper coins and decided he needed to get a business going, something small like a stand or the like. She looked so cute with her face that close that he was tempted to lean to the side and kiss her right now, but he decided it was probably too soon for that. Ryuji just shook his head lightly instead, before insisting. No, I don't want to stand out like that. I don't remember being a noble, but another noble might recognize me. That might be a good thing, but it might also be bad, so I'd rather not risk it. Just show me to the place you were going to show me, please. And thank you again for taking the time to show me around. After hearing his response, Karen turned to the side facing forward. She made sure that Ryuji's arm rubbed fully across her breast in the process. As his arm rubbed across her nipple, she couldn't help sucking in a small gasp from the sensation. She was fairly sure that he hurt her too, which made her face get hot again. As she walked with his arm in hers, she savored the scent of the cologne the whole time. So much for not hanging all over him, she thought derisively. At least he didn't seem to mind. She was savoring the scent so much that she was a little sad when she finally spotted the menswear shop coming into view. A moment later, the crowd had closed in where the two had been and a frustrated sigh could be heard coming from a certain individual. A dark elf clad in a skimpy outfit with two giant meat cleavers hanging from the wide belt around her waist was trying to see through the crowd of people. She was certain she had just spotted the sun elf that she wanted to talk to, but then she lost him in the crowd, and was that a woman with him? If she could just catch another glimpse of them, she would know for sure if it was him. As soon as the crowd parted a bit, she darted off in the direction that she thought they went. He finally came to his senses when he realized that Karen was calling his name. As he looked over at her, she had a look of concern on her face, and he blushed slightly. Thinking furiously, he came up with an excuse. Sorry, I was just lost in thought about some of the things I need to do. This is one reason why I need your help so badly. Without you here, I would get lost in thought and then get lost in the city with no idea how I got there. He reflected that what he said was probably true since he had already done just that the day before. The store they were in front of was a dedicated storefront. There were wide-open archways with folding shutter-style doors on them and large windows with iron latticework grates on two sides of the place to let in a lot of light and fresh air. The lower story of the building was slightly smaller than the upper, and that was in turn smaller than the attic, giving the whole store the impression of a ziggurat turned upside down. It did have sturdy-looking pillars at the corners, so Ryuji supposed that the structure was stable enough. The windows had shutters beside all the windows, and they were painted a gaudy orange color. Overall, this was not what he was expecting. Karen led him inside by his still clasped arm and only released him once they were inside. Almost immediately, a small fussy-looking man about half Ryuji's height with huge eyes came walking briskly over to them. He was wearing a very attractive V-cut shirt in a deep green with loose sleeves and laced cuffs. His pants were light brown leather that looked so well worked it was almost like cotton. Under that, he wore a large gold chain necklace with a motif worked into a large pendant hanging just at the split in the shirt. He was shod in a pair of what Ryuji could only call loafers, but they were dyed the same dark green as the top. Overall, he presented a very tidy picture as he bobbed to a stop in front of him. Hello, my name is Brant Taylor. May I help you find something you like, or perhaps you would like to go ahead and be fitted? Ryuji was impressed that the man wasted no time and got straight to the point. He simply assumed that they wouldn't be in his shop if they had no intention to buy anything, and he was right. Ryuji was impressed with the outfit he had on and told him so. He was also trying very hard not to stare at the bizarre little man, mainly because he couldn't shake the notion that he looked like some kind of oddly drawn anime character with those large eyes of his. I am quite fond of the outfit you are wearing. Perhaps I should just get a set of clothes like that. What do you think, Karen? With the question posed to her, Karen froze for a second, then she looked very critically at the suit the small man had on. She was looking back and forth between Ryuji and the suit. Brant was very obligingly turning this way and that to show her every angle of the clothing he was wearing. I like it, and I agree that you would look very dignified in it. Perhaps not as much as our fine host, but I suspect that you would cut a very sharp figure in that outfit, my great and noble lord. She finally declared in a very serious and very forced tone of voice that was made to sound jokingly pompous. All three of them shared a good laugh, but only he and Karen knew that she was being half serious. The fussy-looking little Brant had a huge grin on his face as he wiped a tear from his eye and declared, "Oh, well, if it's Lord Elf, sir, then I think we should have a bit more help here." He suddenly got a wicked glint in his eye as he put his fingers to his lips and produced an ear-splitting whistle. After massaging their ears for a few seconds to relieve the ringing left by the shrill whistle, Karen and Ryuji heard the sound of several sets of feet hurrying to their location. Suddenly, out of all corners of the shop, came a half-dozen short-statured women or girls with the same huge eyes. Brant, with the same glint in his eyes, half turned to the crowd of ladies and announced in a somewhat mocking tone, "I think that his lordship," a sudden snort of laughter interrupted his words, "has volunteered to try out your latest fashion creations. Be sure that he looks fit for the ball." Turning back to Ryuji and Karen, he kept the same grin on his lips as he spoke to them. "This is my family, my wife, my younger sister, and my 4 girls. Have fun, your lordship." At the word he gave an overly deep bow before looking back at them. "If you make it through trying on all of their new design ideas, I'll give you a half-off discount on the suit you buy this time." After saying his piece, he winked and walked away as the girls closed in from all directions. Ryuji looked to Karen for help, but she was too busy stifling a fit of laughter. A little over an hour, and many traumatically embarrassing moments later, he had purchased 5 outfits and spares. Despite the girls being a bit overzealous in undressing him, nude even, he did quite like several of their designs and purchased those along with the original suit. True to his word, the proprietor gave him a 50% discount on all of his outfits. Ryuji figured it was probably worth it to him to get them a good model to try their crafts on, but he really didn't mind. Ryuji and Karen also had a good laugh at the looks on their faces once they totaled out his purchases. The wife, or perhaps the sister, one of the older 2 ladies anyway, finished adding all of his items up on a piece of scrap cloth using a kohl pencil. As she looked at the total, she got a bit of a worried look on her face, then she faced Ryuji and voiced her concerns. "I have your total, sir. The 5 suits, 2 extra shirts, and 10 underpants come to 2 small gold, 1 small silver, and 3 small copper. That's after the discount, but perhaps I could get my husband to reduce it a little more since you're buying so much at once." One of the daughters proposed that he could pay it out in installments, while the other older lady was grimacing at the bad business practice. She spoke up and insisted that they had to have it all before they could hand over the product, but that they didn't have to have but a bit of it to get started. Ryuji, for his part, had expected the clothing to be a tad expensive, but perhaps not that much. The price still wasn't enough to make him worried. All 6 of the ladies' jaws dropped open when he blithely pulled out the full amount and handed it right over. Their surprise was tempered with confusion when they discovered he had handed over 3 small gold. As the lady holding the money looked way up at him, she seemed about to protest his miscount of the money. He was ready and told her that the other gold was for their help and creativity, and he appreciated the discount but that they really shouldn't sell their wares short. They beamed and promised to have his order finished in a few days' time and would deliver him a couple sets as early as tomorrow evening at his room in the inn. After leaving the menswear store, Ryuji wanted to take Karen to get a dress, but she insisted that they go to the weaponsmithing shop first. Her reasoning was that it was very close by. While he really wanted to get her something, he also figured that she wanted to show him to different places, so he wasn't going to argue with her. He did, however, feel a bit of hesitation in taking her advice on adventuring gear. No, he had to remind himself yet again that it was mercenary gear. The concept of adventuring was a concept for manga and anime, but this was reality, and people who were hired to do dangerous odd jobs were mercenaries. He had found out from Doran that odd job workers around town that did things like sweep, carry packages around, or unload wagons were called ready laborers or ready hands, while those that went out and did the hard or dangerous tasks like fighting or guarding were called mercenaries. Each type had its own guild and guild hall too. Ryuji had half considered joining the Ready Hand Guild as a means of legitimizing his earnings, but he decided he would start a couple businesses or invest in some that were already operating to funnel cash into and build them up so he could launder his money and avoid suspicion. He had reached the conclusion earlier that he should probably do both. Investing in a few businesses first, then starting several afterward so he would have the most options. As long as he kept a fake log of his profits and made sure to pay taxes or tolls or whatever they were called here, he was sure to be okay. Miyako was frantic. She knew that she had just spotted the tall handsome elf guy. This time she absolutely knew it was him, and he definitely had a girl with him. Her heart ached a little at the lost chance to snag a handsome guy like him, but she still wanted his advice on convincing Dorn to teach her magic. Miyako hadn't gotten a good look at the girl because she was too busy trying to make sure it was the guy she was after in the distance. They were a good way ahead of her on one of the main avenues of the city, so it was hard to get a clear look at them or even keep decent track of them. They, fortunately, didn't seem to be in a big hurry, or it would be impossible to track them in this crowd. Then the crowd opened a bit and they were gone. Oh no, she thought, did they stop somewhere? I'll never get to talk to him at this rate. The ramblings of his inner thoughts came to a close as Karen spoke up. This is the shop of a friend of mine named Brogan Hammerhand. He's a little gruff, but that's just how dwarves are, you know. You get used to them after a while, and if they decide they like you, there's no more reliable friend to have. He's helped me out of a pinch a few times before. As Karen was busy exchanging greetings and pleasantries with the young boy, Ryuji was busy looking around the store. He had to admit that his expectations of her knowledge about good mercenary gear, or at least where to get it, seemed to be right on the mark. This store with heavy iron grates for windows let light spill across a dizzying array of weapons. He had no idea of their practicality or quality, but it was certainly an impressive arsenal of what looked to be both iron and steel weapons. There were even a few that seemed to glow a bit in the dim light of the store. Ryuji wasn't sure if those were magical or just very shiny, but they were certainly impressive, at least to his untrained eyes. After a span of less than a minute, Ryuji could hear a heavier set of footfalls pounding up the steps at a fairly rapid pace. A moment later, a somewhat young-looking dwarf popped out of the doorway and darted over to where he and Karen stood. He was wearing a heavy leather apron with pockets full of tools over a pair of cotton trousers and a long-sleeve cotton shirt in a natural tan color. He also wore a sweat-stained cotton bandana over his hair and one other thing. The article of clothing that caught Ryuji's eye was a small leather apron-like item worn over his chin and beard and strapped behind his head. To Ryuji, this was something that brought the absolute reality of this world into focus. There might be dwarves, and they might be good smiths, but that didn't make their beards fireproof. They had to protect their hair just like anybody else if they wanted to keep it from being burned off at the forge. The young dwarf with fiery red hair spilling out the back of his bandana, who was apparently Brogan, rushed over in front of Karen and stammered out a greeting of sorts. "Lass, it's you. I haven't heard from ye in months. I feared that ye had met an untimely end or that ye had gone and left the city fair good. We were worried about ye, where've ye been?" Karen looked decidedly embarrassed by the sudden display of concern and made her hasty reply while Ryuji was left to wonder about the relationship that she had with the young dwarf. Whoa, wait a span, would you? I met a bit of trouble and I've been working at the sleeping tree since then. But that's not why I'm here today. I brought you a customer, his name's Ryuji. He needs a weapon, but he isn't skilled in the use of any. I thought you might sell him one of the lighter swords, or something that he can at least swing fairly easily. As Brogan, the young dwarf smith, shifted his gaze to him, Ryuji could feel his scrutiny, but he was pretty sure there was something else there as well. Perhaps the guy was interested in Karen, but she didn't return his feelings? Ryuji was pretty certain that Karen was into him in a big way, but that might prove a liability here. If things got intense, Ryuji wasn't sure what he could do. He certainly couldn't fight the guy. He'd almost certainly stand no chance against a burly dwarf who swung a hammer for a living. Especially not a dwarf who made weapons and was standing in the middle of an arsenal of his own creation. Ryuji was just about to start urging Karen to leave with him when the dwarf's face split into a big grin and he stuck out his hand in a fist in this world's manner of greeting. Name's Brogan. Any friend of young Miss Karen here's a friend of mine. Least till they prove otherwise. He said that last line with a wink that did very little to clear up the question of their relationship. As Ryuji pressed his fist firmly against the dwarf's with a nod, he continued in a somewhat jovial tone like any merchant would use towards a potential client. So, Karen says ye be needin' a weapon. What did ya have in mind? Ye bein' a pointier, it certainly canna be nothin' heavy. As ye be seein', I canna be makin' no bows, so ye be out o' luck there. Ryuji was quick and self-deprecating in his reply. Oh, it's all right. I can't use one anyway. I can't seem to use axes, maces, spears, swords, hatchets, daggers, or javelins either. I'm just full of talent. But maybe I can learn to use magic. Until that happens though, I'd just like to have a sword to try practicing with and to brandish threateningly at brigands or the like and hope they don't figure out how incompetent I am with the weapon I'm holding. To that end, I was thinking maybe something flashy that looks dangerous? But I guess something well used might make it look like I had a lot of experience with it. I'll leave it up to you. Brogan seemed like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry, and a quick glance told him that Karen was looking at him with horror written all over her face. Neither of the boys seemed to realize he was telling the truth and looked like they thought it was a joke. Brogan seemed to finally settle on a light chuckle before he continued. I've got ye. Then a simple short sword'll be what you're wantin'. Come this way. I may be havin' a flashy something for ye to scare off ruffians with. The sword he showed to Ryuji didn't seem like much, but it was light enough that he could swing it. When he inquired about the price, Brogan told him it would be 1 small gold and 4 large silvers. Ryuji was getting ready to protest the price when Karen leaned in and very quietly told him that it was a really good price. She followed that up with a bombshell. He must really like you to sell one of his own pieces of banded steel for that price. Look, you can see the quality in the blade because it has all those stripes in it. Only dwarven masters can make that kind of steel. You should take his offer. He's taking a loss on that piece, and I'm sure it'll hurt his pride if you turn it down. Ryuji thought it over and decided on what he would do. He was used to being very tight with his money, but he decided that he would need to break that habit since he wasn't going to ever run out of money in this world. I like this, and I agree that it's just flashy enough to do what I want. But somehow I feel that it's not quite enough. Ryuji could see a look of indignation forming on the dwarf's face and went on with a slight smile. I know, how about I get this and a dagger? Maybe something with gold and gems or something? You know, one of those expensive pieces that aren't too practical, but can be used as a status symbol. I was thinking something in the 2 to 4 gold range? Brogan was about to start his protest when Ryuji's words finally registered. Suddenly the face-splitting grin was back. Mind you, this grin had a lot more impact because it was right above the featureless leather apron over Brogan's beard, which had the effect of making his face look like it ended at his grin. That and the odd anatomical feature of dwarves having a rather large front row of teeth made for a disconcerting grin. Oi, a fancy dagger, is it? I seem to remember having a few of those. Lads, why don't you be showin' the pointier here some of those poncy trinkets ye be leaking so much? I be thinkin' he's a skin for one. After saying that, he stepped back and just crossed his arms, with that same grin on his face. Immediately, the boys rushed all over the shop and began gathering glittering bits, before rushing back to him. It was a procession of glimmering flashy weapons that ranged from just shy of being swords all the way down to knives that could fit in a pocket. The only commonality among all of them seemed to be that they were all made of gold or silver or something like them and fitted with an assortment of precious stones and jewels. It turned out they shared one other trait in common. They were all the works of these 2 boys, not the master smith, Brogan. After looking through all of the offered items, Ryuji narrowed it down to 3. He first ruled out all of the ones that were too long or too short. Then he weeded out all of the ones that weren't comfortable. Unfortunately, that got rid of all of the offerings from one of the boys. It seemed that he was too focused on looks and didn't pay any mind to comfort or practicality at all. With his final selection narrowed down, he turned to Karen and asked her which one she thought would look the best on him. At first, she looked aghast that he would ask her, but then she calmed down and thought about it. She looked closely at all of them and held them up to Ryuji's waist. She was mumbling about his new clothing cuts and colors as she looked critically at each in turn. After a few minutes, she settled on one of them. The one she chose was a thin stiletto style of blade with an ornate silver and gold handle carved into the figure of a voluptuous nude woman's upper torso. It was set with about a dozen small emeralds between the pommel and the sheath. The sheath featured a carving of the same woman but in a full frontal pose. Ryuji was surprised at Karen's choice because he was sure that this wouldn't be the one she picked, even though it was, in fact, the one that he liked the most. After picking out the dagger, he took off his belt and threaded it through the belt loops of both the sword and the dagger. He then pulled out 5 small golds and handed them over before Brogan could pronounce a price. Ryuji knew that the reason that Brogan was having the boys show off their work was because it was rare for them to get such a good sale. He also knew without being told that the price of their work was much lower than that of the master smith and probably wasn't even as expensive as the sword, despite being fancier and made with precious materials. That was the reason he paid so much, and the gesture wasn't lost on the master smith. Brogan saw them off personally. As they were walking out, he whispered a thank you to Ryuji and promised that each of the boys would get an equal share of his gift. Karen, for her part, was awestruck by his generosity. Luckily, she didn't realize how much he was having to force himself to be so generous. The only reason he had decided to be that generous was because he could relate to the penniless boys working under the smith and knew what a blessing it would have been for somebody to suddenly overpay him for his work in his previous life. Karen was quick to list off several armor shops after that and suggested that they go to a certain one. Ryuji wasn't sure why they didn't just buy armor while they were at Brogan's shop and asked her. "Did you see any armor there?" "Brogan is a weaponsmith. For armor, you have to go see an armorsmith. Some rare few blacksmiths will do both, but as a general rule they tend to specialize in one or the other, or they may work on other things like shoting horses or making hardware for buildings. Also, it's not fair to keep all your business with one shop when you go out. A noble has to spend money amongst various places. It sets the right image, and image is very important whether you're a noble or a mercenary. The fact that you happen to be both is beside the point. At some point, you're going to remember who you are, and you'll be glad that you have a good image here in Lyril." Karen said all of that with such confidence that Ryuji just had to nod along. Then it suddenly occurred to him that this was the first time he had heard the name of the city he was in. He quickly changed the subject to that of the world around him. Karen seemed a bit anxious at first, probably thinking that he might be mad at her for bringing up his lost memory, but she talked about it all anyway. After a short time, she was smiling and chatting merrily as before about the general topography and politics between various places. It seemed that Ryuji had been set down in a country called the Tsoaf Kingdom. The capital of the kingdom was Tsoan, and it was far to the south of them. They were in Lyril, which sat across the river of the same name. The city was named for an elven water goddess who legends say fell in love with the first duke of the city, over 800 years ago. On a less joyful note, the country was bordered to the north by the Brahman kingdom. The two countries had been at war for nearly a century. Apparently, there was a lot of iron in the ground near the border of the two countries as well as a silver mine. Both countries claimed the rights to the land and waged war over the small strip of land from the edge of the Ganos Mountains to the east to the Kalandri Ocean in the west. Karen looked increasingly troubled as she talked about the war. So Ryuji began looking for a way to change the subject. The last thing he wanted was for Karen to associate her first date with thoughts and memories of the war. As if in answer to his prayers, he looked over and spotted a shop sporting a beautiful dress on the open patio. Ryuji quickly grabbed her hand and began pulling her toward the shop in question. He glanced at her for a brief moment and she was blushing a deep red and looking at the hand holding her own as she was pulled out of her gloomy train of thought by force. The dress on display was a red and gold affair with a long skirt and alluring frills running along the right shoulder strap. Karen flatly refused to try it on. Apparently, she was the decisive type of shopper and didn't shop around forever like most of the girls Ryuji had ever heard of. Even his mother liked to shop for a long time even though they didn't have a lot of money to buy things with. By contrast, Karen took one look at the dress and declared that it wouldn't look good on her and she didn't want it. Thankfully she did walk into the store though, and it served to change the subject. It only took her a few moments to find a dress that she did like, one that was light green with no frills or anything on it. It did look like it would look good on her, and the attendant suggested a gold leaf belt to go with it. In the end, it only took her a few minutes to be fitted for the dress, and she was ready to leave. Ryuji told the attendant that he wanted a similar dress and shoes in both a deep shade of blue and a cream color sent to the inn and paid for it all. They were making their way toward the armor shop that Karen wanted to show him when he spotted a group of familiar faces. It was the trio from the day before, the thugs who had stolen his coin pouches and kicked him numerous times. It seemed that they spotted him at the same time he saw them, because the big one nudged the leader's arm and grinned. Just as the three were getting ready to come over and make trouble for Ryuji with big grins on their faces, the crowd parted a bit between them. Suddenly they started to go pale and look for a different place to be. Ryuji smiled to himself and slid the sword he had been in the process of drawing back into its scabbard. That's when he felt murderous intent and darted his eyes around. He was almost convinced that he had been imagining it when he caught a brief glimpse of Karen's face turned in the direction of the thieves. When he turned to look fully at her, she was already looking forward and the murderous aura was gone so quick he couldn't be sure he hadn't imagined it. Perhaps there was more to her than he thought. No, he probably just imagined it, he thought to himself. Miyako had just spotted the pair she was searching for and was headed toward them when three guys came rushing in her direction. The three seemed so lost in looking over their shoulders that the one in front, a tall lanky guy with thug written all over him, bumped into her and knocked her over. She landed on her but hard, and it seemed the guy had just now realized that he knocked her over. Miyako was expecting to hear him apologize or even make up an excuse and keep on walking. She jumped up and started looking for the tall handsome sun elf when the thug's words came to her ears. "Hey, watch where you're going. You should pay me for being so rude, lady." She slowly turned her head to look at the three guys. Once they saw the look in her eyes, it was only then that the short one noticed the huge weapons hanging from her waist. He began frantically pulling on the other's clothing. He was hoping to get away before she decided how to respond, but he was already too late. Miyako was already in a bad mood from several near misses with her intended quarry, and now this? It was time to blow off some steam. The moment a ruckus broke out, the crowd had dispersed and the guard was called. They arrived just as she finished tying the three thugs up. The lieutenant guardsman looked a bit bewildered as he walked up to the scene. Here were three guys who looked fairly tough but were beaten black and blue and tied up by a single smallish dark elf. At that point, he spotted the cleavers, and just as he was about to say something about them, the girl held out her guild ID. The guard took the small block of wood with the unique scorched brand of the Mercenaries Guild on it, and her rank in the center was a 7 with 2 lines under it. That was a pretty respectable ranking. It was in the second tier, but just barely, so nobody that you might have even heard of in passing, but she was getting there. He knew that guild rankings started at tier 1 and rank 8 and worked their way to 1 before jumping to the next tier. Usually, nobody would be very well known before they reached the third tier. In fact, there were almost no 5th-tier mercenaries. Just to be sure, the guard took out a small pendant and pressed it to the block of wood, and the magic in the ID activated. Above the block of wood stood a floating image of the dark elf Miyako, holding her cleavers. That was indeed the person whose name was also listed on the ID. Satisfied that she was who she claimed to be, the guard heard her out. Just as she was finishing up her account of how the guy attacked her after she yelled at him and she proceeded to beat the crap out of them, the other guard came up and whispered into the lieutenant's ear. "Sir, we've actually been trying to catch this group for a little while. There's even a reward for them because they attacked a couple of the lesser nobles." As soon as the regular guardsmen finished talking to the lieutenant, they looked over at Miyako. She wore a big grin on her face that told them she had heard every word. Honestly, why do elves have to have such good hearing? Well, whatever, he was going to pay her anyway. After handing her a couple small silver, she thanked him and rushed off. Miyako wasn't sure she could catch up after this last mess she had ended up in. With determination in her stride, she set off in the last direction she'd seen them heading in. The armor shop turned out to be a fairly straightforward visit. The shop in question had a good assortment of different types of armor, but Ryuji couldn't stand the weight of most of them. He bought some basic boiled hide armor with metal plate strips attached at various places. And a couple pairs of boots of a similar type. He commented to Karen that it didn't look like it was actually made of leather at all, and she explained how it was made. The armorers would take the leather and soften it in water, then mold it. After it sat in the mold, it was time to be treated. Once it was hard, it then got fitted with the metal strips that were cold riveted in place. After all that, the outer surface was brushed with a special mixture of glue and crushed stones or crystals to give it extra protective properties. Ryuji marveled at the method for making such armor. It was also easier to pick out since armor, unlike clothing, was adjustable. He looked through the different armor sets for sale and settled on a set studded with chips of light green crystals in the blue-tinted coating. After only a few minutes of fitting and adjusting, he was wearing his new set of armor. The set cost significantly less than he was expecting at only 6 large silver and another 4 small silver per pair of boots, totaling only 7 large silver. Karen again explained that with how little metal was in the set, it was just that much cheaper. By comparison, a set of half-plate mail, the kind that only covers the front half of the wearer, costs 3 small gold. That was one of the cheaper sets of metal armor too. But all of those prices reflected how much metal was worth. Also, there was a high demand for better armors in the military, which drove the prices even higher. Ryuji paid for the set and they set off to get a little snack before returning to the inn. That was when Ryuji got the idea that he might like to find some kind of jewelry for Karen in addition to the dress. As they walked and talked about various things, Ryuji was scanning the stalls to find a suitable gift for her. Miyako was very upset, but she had accepted defeat for the time. There was no helping it, the trio of idiots had simply cost her the chance to catch up to the Sun Elf guy. Oh well, there was always the next time she was in town. With that, she was just about to head to the inn she was staying at. Suddenly she was struck by the realization that she recognized the elf she had just passed. At first, he hadn't registered in her mind because he was now wearing a set of blue-green armor, but that was him. She turned and rushed after the now distant and retreating figures. Karen was saying something about getting some skewers of meat when the smell suddenly caught Ryuji's attention. At first, it was just a nag at the corner of his awareness, but in no time, it was all he could think about. Karen was saying something about one of the stalls to the side, but that didn't seem important at the moment, only that smell. When Karen looked back, Ryuji was gone. She looked frantically for him, but she couldn't spot him anywhere in the crowd. Had he gotten lost? Had he kept walking when she stopped, or was he looking at something nearby? She began searching the stalls and shops around as she equally tried to hurry in the direction that they were heading before. Where could he have gone? She was in such a state of worry that she didn't notice the dark elf passing her in the same state she was in. For a good minute, or this world's equivalent, Ryuji just kept walking through the crowd. By this point he wasn't even able to think, there was kind of a red haze in his vision. Finally, he turned into an alleyway and took off again. What was that smell? As he exited the alleyway, he spotted a stand selling meat skewers. That was it. He had to have some this very instant. As he approached the stand, he could feel the drool at the corners of his mouth and went to wipe it away. That's when he got a real good fright. He had a muzzle, and the hand that he wiped the drool with was gray and furry with short claws at the tips of the fingers. Ryuji looked around and finally spotted what he was looking for in the edge of the alleyway he had just left. There was a puddle in the mud of the alleyway and just enough light that he might be able to see himself in it. He tentatively peeked into the puddle and the sight that greeted him drew a yelp from him. He was not an elf anymore. Miyako rounded the entrance to the alleyway, and standing there near the other end was a dog Beastfolk. Well, maybe? He did look a little wild and scruffy to be a dog, so maybe a wolf Beastfolk? Either way, there was no denying that he was wearing the very same set of armor that she had been chasing just now. What was going on, she wondered to herself? Had she been so obsessed with catching the sun elf that she thought that this random Beastfolk was him? Confused and disappointed, she walked out of the alleyway past the equally confused-looking guy as he stared into a puddle. What was his problem anyway? Ryuji was shocked, to say the least. Here was a completely different face staring up at him. Just when he had gotten used to the idea of being an elf, now he was a Beastfolk? Oh, wait. That's right, he had been clawed by that werewolf. Oh no, did that mean he was going to be a werewolf too? Apparently, it did. Finally, the smell caught his attention again and he couldn't contain his hunger anymore. He went around the corner and bought 4 skewers. He had meant to share them with Karen when he bought them, but then the realization dawned on him that he couldn't go back to her like this. He walked away from the stand after paying 1 large copper. The merchant's comment about him being a light eater didn't even register in his confused state of mind. He was just wondering what to do in this situation. Should he approach Karen and tell her all about the werewolf? No, he still didn't know how serious being a werewolf might be, and he didn't want to scare her with this. As he was pondering what to do, he was also slowly savoring the flavor of the meat skewers. At least, if he were stuck looking like this, nobody would question him about wanting the meat. But then what about his favorite, bread? Well, Beastfolk probably ate bread more readily than elves ate meat. Then it occurred to him that Karen wasn't the only relationship on the line. Teresa knew him as the tall thin elf Ryuji, and also Dorn, his new magic instructor. He might not be able to reconcile those relationships if he lost them. He was just getting himself worked into a fit when a voice burst into his worries with sheer decibels. A woman was standing there in one of the many lean-to stalls along the street and had her hands cupped to her mouth. Ryuji began to think that she probably didn't need any help with a voice like that when the content of her boisterous call struck him. She was yelling about jewelry. That was just what he wanted, and if his approach would shut her up, then all the better. Ryuji walked up to the stall and hoped the woman stopped yelling to greet him. He asked her for a recommendation and she went through a good number of her wares. In the end, Ryuji was left stuck on whether to get Karen a pair of earrings or a bracelet. Then it occurred to him that she was generally in a manual labor kind of position and the earrings would be more out of the way. Then he realized that he couldn't remember if she had pierced ears. He decided that he would take the chance and picked out a pair made from some kind of greenish metal. When the woman looked skeptically at him, he asked her why and she told him that those were very expensive since they were made from orichalcum. Ryuji inquired about the price and found that they were over 1 small gold for the pair. These earrings were almost as expensive as his sword, for crying out loud. At that point, it occurred to Ryuji that he might not get another chance to give her a present, so he settled on those same earrings and bought them, much to the surprise of the vendor. The pair of earrings had a simple leaf and flower pattern to them, with the center of the flower being occupied by a large garnet. The vendor praised him for the purchase and explained that the metal was very sturdy and would likely never break despite any kind of abuse. She also said that if the girl he was buying them for got a fever the day after putting them in, to give her honey and have her cool off in the river for a couple hours and her body would accept the metal. After that warning, she saw him off with a smile, but he was still very troubled. Ryuji realized he was lost a few minutes later. He began looking around for anything familiar and finally spotted the Guildhall a bit after that. He made his way over to the Guildhall and he knew his way back to the inn from there. He walked slowly back towards the inn, considering what he would tell Teresa. He had no idea what he would say if Karen were back. He was in the alley a couple streets down from the sleeping tree, still finishing off the meat skewers, when he noticed something. The hand holding his skewer wasn't furry anymore. He quickly gulped down the last of the meat and began feeling of his face. Sure enough, he was an elf again. That was great news. now he wouldn't have to apply all the worst-case scenarios he had dreamt up on the way here. He made his entrance to find a somewhat worried-looking Teresa, who quickly rushed over to him. "Where's Karen? Didn't she go out with you on a date, to show you around town?" The answer to the whole mess hit Ryuji all at once, and he adopted a sheepish apologetic look as he explained. "We did, and everything was fine till the end. You see, I wanted to get her another present and walked over to a stall to buy her these." He displayed the earrings, to which Teresa's breath caught in her throat as she wondered yet again why such a rich fellow was staying in her inn. "But after I bought them, I went back where I thought she was before, but I guess I got confused and lost her instead." Ryuji winced and kind of shrugged. "I finally managed to find my way back here, but now I need to go back to the shop for the evening before the master there gets mad at me. I really wanted to give these to her on our outing. I really don't have time to wait though. Could you please apologize to her for me when she gets back?" At Teresa's nod, Ryuji headed for the door again. He turned around just as he got there. "Also, could I ask you not to tell Karen about the earrings?" "Wait, that's right, does she have pierced ears?" When Teresa nodded with a wide grin on her face, Ryuji matched it for a second before rushing out the door. Ryuji raced back to the magic shop and found Dorn there waiting with the same grin on his face. It was like everyone was in on the same joke, and Ryuji wasn't sure if he was the center of that joke, and if he was, then he wasn't sure he cared. More obscure rambling lectures on the nature of magic awaited that evening. Dorn took a good candlespan, something close to an hour, to hit his stride. Once he did, the lectures became more interesting and less random. The main topics of discussion for the evening lesson were to be magic calligraphy, the affinity certain materials have with the magic elements, and how the different elements combine to form certain types of spells. Dorn began writing some of the symbols for the differing spells out at one point to illustrate the difference. At this point, Ryuji made a horrifying discovery. "Oh man, I can't read any of that." Dorn stopped in the middle of his lecturing and looked over at his new apprentice for a moment before the words registered. At this point, he looked back and forth between Ryuji and the writing on the page, then adopted an apologetic look on his face. The look was disconcerting with the dwarf's large teeth, but Ryuji wasn't about to point this out, that would be too rude. Sorry laddie. I be forgettin' that ye dunna know these things. Ye'll be needin' to learn magic writing anyway. It's not like regular words can be used for the likes of magic spells." With that explanation, Ryuji suddenly felt much relieved. Yes, he would have to learn 2 languages, but it was somehow better than needing to know the local language for it. It meant that he wasn't any more handicapped than he would normally be at this point. In fact, the characters set for each of the 3 major types of magic were all different. There was a set specifically for casting, summoning, and enchanting. And he would need to learn all of those in addition to the regular language of the land. Then there were obscure languages that had spells written in them which he might need to learn if he were to try to become a magic scholar in the future. Ryuji asked about the obscure spells and lost tomes and the like, and Dorn filled him in on what those were about. Apparently, there were once a lot more spells known than in the current age. A lot of those spells were recorded in tomes in different dialects that hadn't ever been translated for whatever reason. The problem wasn't that the magic language had changed, but that the languages of the land did. There were sometimes, however, rare glyphs of the magic language to be found in those kinds of tomes. Usually, they would only work in that one spell though, because nobody knew the meaning of those glyphs to put them into any other spells, and a lot of those spells were very unique. Ryuji was fascinated as the lessons naturally progressed to the magic affinity of various minerals and substances. He quickly realized just how vital his limited knowledge of chemistry and geology was once again. At that point, he looked around and spotted blank tomes for sale and made a mental note to buy one before he left for the evening. They were well into a lecture on the nature of complex multi-element spells when Dorn looked up at the window. He had finally noticed how late it was getting. Ryuji was wondering how long he would keep going, but he was too interested to interrupt him for something so trivial. Dorn seemed lost in thought for a moment. When he next looked at Ryuji, he had a wicked smirk on his face, once again made all the worse by the anatomy of his jaw structure. Quiz time. What followed was a rapid-fire barrage of questions over the things they had discussed. Ryuji only got a couple wrong, or more like he didn't give the answer in as much detail as Dorn wanted. By the end of the quiz session, Dorn was looking very surprised indeed. To Ryuji, this was hardly a warm-up compared to the intensive memory-based learning style that his old school had used. Honestly, anybody that went to a Japanese high school would be an utter failure if they couldn't remember this much right after the lecture was over. They would probably be seen as a failure if they couldn't recall the same thing several months later to take their exams. That evening, after buying his blank tome for making a journal of past and future knowledge, Ryuji left feeling that he had truly learned something valuable. Dorn had a slightly different impression of the evening. To him, the memory capacity and knowledge of this young elf were nothing short of miraculous. While it was true that many elves were gifted with an aptitude for magic, this one seemed to be positively born for it. Dorn couldn't have asked for a better candidate for apprenticeship, and he knew it. This was a disciple to watch in the future and be cherished in the present. Karen was very upset when she returned to the inn, but Teresa told her to calm down. "Your elf guy came back here a little while ago. Apparently, he got himself lost, but managed to find his way here. He wanted to wait for you, but he said he had to go back to work." Karen looked quite puzzled about the last part, because she didn't think Ryuji had a job yet. Or for that matter, that he would need one. In the end, she just sighed and nodded her head before returning to her room to change for work. That evening was a disaster. Karen couldn't concentrate at all. She dropped the dishes a couple times, and she scorched a pot of chowder. Finally, Teresa told her to just go clean the rooms and that she would handle the kitchen. It was in that way that Karen missed when Ryuji came in late that evening, nearly at dark. As soon as she spotted the elf coming down the stairs, Teresa called for Karen to come down also. When she got down to the dining room, she understood immediately, and a look of relief flooded her face. She quickly took the tray of food that Teresa handed her and walked briskly over to Ryuji. Ryuji had heard everything even though his back was turned to the whole scene. Elven hearing was awesome. He was sitting in anticipation of the coming events. Karen then approached him on his left side and set his tray down, and he thanked her politely. Karen stood there for several moments as he just blithely tried the chowder and cheese bread. She was getting irritated with him as she became ever more impatient to hear his explanation. She already heard what happened from Teresa, but that wasn't the point. She felt like he should at least explain it himself, or better, he could apologize for making her worry so much. Ryuji could feel her tension building as he seemed to ignore her. Just when she seemed like she was about to say something, he pretended to notice her standing there. "Oh right, your tip." Karen couldn't believe the words that came out of his mouth. Did he have no idea how worried she had been? He rummaged in his pouch for a second and came out with something he set on the edge of the table, simply saying "Here you go" and smiling at her like nothing was wrong at all. Karen was on the verge of tears and grabbed his tip off the edge of the table and was getting ready to throw it at him when the feeling of what was in her hands didn't match the feeling of coins. When that clicked, she looked down at her hand and found she was holding the single most gorgeous pair of earrings she had ever seen in her life. Suddenly, the tears in her eyes were for a completely different reason, and she couldn't hold back any longer. She started alternating between bawling and laughing as she ran back into the kitchen, clutching the earrings to her chest as if she were afraid her heart would jump right out if she didn't hold it in. Meanwhile, Teresa simply watched the whole affair with a grin from the corner of the bar. She did have to reassure several of the other customers who were looking menacingly at the young elf without understanding the situation. He was quite sharp though, and paid for a couple rounds of ale for everyone. Good drink will do wonders to calm the nerves. That night, before going to sleep, Ryuji started writing his magic primer. He started with everything he could recall from any of his science classes, and was followed by everything he remembered from all of his math classes. He also wrote in everything he could remember about historic battles. Most of his history would be useless, because it was just memorizing the names of people and places, and the dates that major events or people lived. The little bits of political maneuvering and diplomacy that he could recall ever learning about, he also wrote down lest he forgets them and needs them in the future. He then left a huge gap before starting the next section. He wasn't sure what else he might remember, but he wanted the room to write as much of it down as he possibly could. His next section was all the magic-related things he had thus learned in shorthand kanji. Once he realized how odd his writing was to this world, he decided to write all of the language arts in a different section altogether. He found that between the katakana, the hiragana, and the kanji there was a huge volume of nothing but language that he would have to write, and he was only going to get a start on it tonight, unlike the magic-related portion that he wrote out in full. The last part of the volume he used as a journal, and he wasn't about to skimp on writing down his account of life events since coming here. His time here had been something of a whirlwind. He was amazed that his time here took 3 full pages to write down. Finally, he got the idea to write a little bit about his old life so he would always have something to remember it by. Ryuji didn't get very far before he found himself crying and just couldn't continue. He cried himself to sleep that night, remembering his family that he would never see again. Nakano Aimi was having a pretty good day. This was the day that her crush would be showing his talent at the school exhibition soccer match. He might not be the most popular boy, and he certainly wasn't the best soccer player, but he was the boy she really liked anyway. They were currently in 5th period, her absolute favorite. Aimi wasn't very fond of algebra too, but there was a bonus. This was the only class that she had with Ryuji. He sat 2 seats in front of her to the left, and at times like this the sun would shine through the window and he would absolutely glow, just the way she always saw him. There was just one little problem. Aimi had never been able to work up the courage to talk to him. She kept hoping for a chance to bump into him in the hall or something like that. Aimi was a fan of rom-com manga and kept hoping that she could get tangled up in one of those kinds of situations with Ryuji one day. The bell tolled for the end of class, and she hurried to catch a glimpse of him as he left the classroom. As she was peeking out from behind the lockers at him down the hall, she was scared nearly out of her skirt. Her friend Amain had snuck up on her and grabbed her by the shoulder. Once Amain finished laughing, she spoke to the now embarrassed Aimi. "I don't get it. Why don't you just talk to him? I mean, it's not like he has a girlfriend or even a girl he likes, right? If you just talk to him, I'm sure that he'll go out with you." Aimi might have been flustered, but she wasn't going to take this sitting down. "Oh, what would you know? You've always been so pretty with your long hair, and you've had a big chest since middle school. Hayato approached you on what, the 2nd day of high school? It's just not fair to compare me to you, Amain. If I had half your looks, I'm sure I could just go up and talk to him like you say, but I don't." Amain grabbed Aimi by the arm and dragged her off to their next class. "You always sell yourself short, Aimi. You are cute. You may not be the ravishing beauty that I am, but you're still plenty cute enough to get the likes of him. I still don't get why you like Noguchi." Aimi rolled her eyes at her friend's bragging. "Oh, shut up. You're a real pain, you know that? Even if you are pretty, I don't get why Hayato keeps going out with a spoiled brat like you." With that, Aimi stuck her tongue out at Amain, and the latter chased her through the halls to their next class with them giggling the whole time. 2 different hall monitors yelled at them to stop running in the halls. Later that evening, Aimi was in the stands watching the final qualifying game, the in-school exhibition match between the A team and the B team. It had been a very close match with the B team keeping up the whole time. The A team looked mad that they hadn't been able to trounce the B team like they thought they would. The last few seconds of the game were extremely tense for everyone watching. Amain was there too, but she was rooting for the A team because Hayato was on the A team. As the seconds ticked down, the 2 girls got even louder, especially when it looked like Ryuji was about to score a goal just before the buzzer. Aimi had been holding her bladder for almost 30 minutes now, and when Ryuji made his kick, she almost peed on herself as she was cheering. It was such a disappointment that they didn't win, she almost wanted to cry. Then she spotted Ryuji on the field, and he was smiling, and she couldn't help feeling silly. Why should she cry if Ryuji was okay with the results? Honestly, he was just so positive all the time it made her want to squeal. But maybe he's just hiding his disappointment, then I could finally talk to him and comfort him and become his girlfriend. Or maybe I'll just follow him and wish I had the courage to speak up like I always do. She had to go to the bathroom so bad it was starting to hurt. Once that was done, she ran after Ryuji and his teammates. For a long time now, Aimi had been stalking or shyly following behind Ryuji. She wasn't sure which way he went, and so she had to ask a couple of people to find out. Aimi was pretty sure that she could hear some of Ryuji's teammates laughing and talking as she ran to the edge of the alleyway. She cautiously peeked out of the alleyway, and what she saw was not at all what she was expecting. There were a bunch of people running towards the far corner of the street. She spotted the team uniforms at the corner that everyone was running towards, and she got a really bad feeling all of a sudden. Aimi ran up and pushed her way through the crowd toward the members of the B team. When she got next to them, they all looked surprised to see her. She quickly began scanning their faces for Ryuji's, but he wasn't there. Maybe he hadn't come with them after all? It was then that she glanced in the direction that everyone else was looking, and her heart stopped beating in her chest. Lying there bleeding on the street was Ryuji, the object of her every waking fantasy, and he wasn't breathing or even blinking. That was the last thing she remembered, besides a lot of screaming that she was pretty sure she was doing. Much later that night, she found herself in her apartment, somehow. She couldn't remember walking here, nor could she recall anybody bringing her. That's when the image of Ryuji lying on the street came back to her, and she vomited and collapsed on the kitchen floor where she had been standing. Her parents were both in Tokyo, with her brother, who was in college. The only one in the apartment was her. As she lay sobbing on the kitchen floor, she vaguely thought she heard the phone ring. She couldn't bring herself to answer it. She didn't want to talk to anybody right now. It hit her like a sword being stabbed through her heart. She would never get the chance to talk to Ryuji. It was too much, and she couldn't take it anymore. She had to do something to make her heart feel better, but what? She couldn't think at all. Her head hurt, but it was a dull background noise compared to her aching heart. Still, she needed to take something for it. Aimi went to the medicine cabinet and got out the bottle of aspirin and got a glass of water to swallow it with. Next thing she knew, she was swallowing handfuls of pills and gulping down water to wash them down. There, now she might feel a little better. She sat down next to the tub and began crying again. Suddenly, Aimi jerked awake. Where was she though? Then it hit her, she had committed suicide by overdosing on aspirin in her apartment. This place looked a little too cramped to be a doctor's office. That didn't even consider the fact she was pretty sure that if she had been in the hospital that she would have woke up in a hospital bed. If this wasn't the hospital, then what did that mean? Also, where was she? She glanced around the strange office until she realized that there was actually somebody sitting behind the desk. It was just hard to tell, because there was so much paper on the desk that he was pretty well hidden. Then he spoke in a slightly gruff voice. "I'll be with you in a second, just let me finish this one thing up." She responded without thinking about it. "Oh no, take your time." That's when she realized that she could see through the screen that he was typing on the other side of, and the characters didn't look anything like any form of Japanese. Then she spotted his fingers typing and realized they were blue and had golden claws on the tips. She caught her breath and began wondering about the being on the other side of the papers. She didn't have long to wonder. "There, that should do for now. Now let's deal with your situation." As he said this, the absurdly strange person stood up and stretched. He had blue skin and hair. In fact, his entire chest was covered in blue hair to his waist where it stopped at a pair of dress slacks. When he turned his head to look in her direction, she saw with a start that he had red, glowing, pupilless eyes and a single short gold horn growing from the center of his forehead. There were several words that would describe somebody like him. Yokai, Yasha, or Yuma. The blue Yuma spoke to her again after she had taken in his appearance for a moment. "Yes, I get that reaction a lot. I just had a boy in here yesterday, in fact, he was from your world. I'll give you the essay." It was too much to hope for, but just maybe this Yuma was talking about Ryuji. "Please, sir?" Was this boy named Noguchi Ryuji, by any chance? Please. With her final word, she was already breaking down into tears and advancing toward the Yuma. The Yuma just calmly observed her with a raised eyebrow as he responded. Humph, yes, he actually was. I take it you knew him then? Well, I had intended to send you to a different world, but I can see that's out. Keep in mind that I can't send you to the same spot exactly, so once you get there, you'll have to search for him on your own. Fortunately, there's only one continent on the world I'm sending you to, so that should help. Also, he got the same choice of starting gear I'm going to give you, so you should be able to find him quick enough if you listen for somebody that stands out. Aimi practically melted from relief as the Yuma explained her choices to her. You will start over in an adult body, and you will have the choice of starting equipment. You can start with a fearsome weapon that can't be stolen and the skills to use it, an unparalleled spell book that can't be stolen and the magic talent needed to use it, or an ever-full coin purse that can't be stolen and the charisma to make use of it. Please make your choice quickly. Aimi thought about Ryuji and what he probably took. He seemed to her to be the bold, heroic type who wouldn't back down from anything. A strong warrior type, so that's what she chose too. She would have to train hard and earn his respect so that she could fight along beside him in this new world. Suddenly, Aimi found herself standing in a wide-open plain. In the middle distance, she could see a clump of bushes and some animals, probably gathered around a place to drink. It reminded her of TV footage she had seen of Africa. As she went a step forward, she became aware of the giant two-handed great axe she was holding the handle of in front of her. As she picked it up, she was amazed by how light it felt in her hands. There was no denying the weight of this thing because it left a big gouge in the dirt where she had pulled it from. As she was busily twirling the axe and marveling at her new strength, she became aware of another fact. When she stopped twirling the axe and looked at her arm, she had fur. Aimi freaked out a little as she looked at her almost orange and black striped fur and sharp claws. Wait, am I a tiger? She thought. Ryuji woke up early again, only this time he didn't head for the wizard's shop. Instead, he took the odd bathing cloak that had been delivered to his room the evening before and headed for the river. He didn't have much experience, or more like no experience, in washing clothes by hand because he was from Japan, where most people had washing machines to do their clothing. Upon arrival, he found that there were a lot of women and children gathered around the stone staircases leading into the water, but they were mostly beast folk of various kinds. Remembering what the old cat at the market had told him, he decided he would test that and approached the river anyway. As he approached, several of the younger women seemed a bit flustered at first, but he pretended to ignore them and they all seemed to calm down. At least until he began stripping his shirt and pants off. The older women and the children, along with the few men that were there, just ignored him in turn, but the young women down to the older girls all seemed to be paying rapt attention. Ryuji smiled at them and winked before pulling out the bathing cloak and putting it on. As he was putting it on, he could swear he heard a chorus of groans. That answered his question. It wasn't unanimous that he should be ignored, so he opted to use the bathing cloak after all. As he went about the process of washing his clothing, several of the younger children began playing in the bubbles that were floating downstream from him. For the most part, he ignored them, but he had to admit they were cute, splashing about and trying to catch the bubbles. He was just finishing with his shirt and hanging it beside his pants on the railing to dry a bit when he heard a scream. Ryuji looked over and spotted one of the young children in the water beyond the railing. The railing, having been intended to keep an adult from washing away, did little to help the tiny beastfolk girl. It was then that he saw one of the older beastfolk women getting all upset. He didn't think twice about what he needed to do. Without any hesitation, Ryuji stripped the bathing cloak off and tossed it on the railing. The next moment he dove into the river head first, and as he surfaced, he began making powerful strokes toward the young girl downstream. He was glad for his summertime swimming lessons at school. He could hear a commotion on the bank of the river but ignored it and concentrated on swimming. Just a few meters before he could reach her, the little cat girl, by the look of her, slipped under the water's surface. Cursing, Ryuji caught his breath and dove under after her. It was dark under the surface of the water and hard to see, but he finally caught a glimpse of her struggling ahead of him. He made for her as fast as he possibly could, but she stopped struggling just before he reached her and went limp. He caught her under her arms and hugged her back to his chest, then made haste for the surface. As he broke the surface of the river, he could hear yelling and cheering, but he didn't have time to think about that. He began swimming with one arm while holding the limp girl with the other. Before long, another set of stairs came into view, and he began swimming towards them at a steep angle. He was worried that he wasn't going to make it to the stairs when the end of a wooden pole was thrust into the water just in front of him. He grabbed it without hesitation, and several people on the other end of the pole began pulling him into the staircase. As soon as he touched his feet on the stairs, someone grabbed the little girl from his arms. He spent a moment there catching his breath. There were a bunch of people telling him that he was awesome and that he was great and things like that, but something else caught his attention more. Wailing could be heard above the din of the crowd, and he distinctly heard someone say, "I'm sorry, but she's gone." Ryuji got up and rushed over to where the older catwoman was crying over the limp form of the little cat girl. Ryuji heard someone saying that it was okay, at least he tried. He ignored them and pushed the old woman aside before kneeling next to the girl. Ryuji leaned her head back and opened her mouth, but he couldn't hear her breathing. He didn't wait the correct 10 seconds, but instead placed his ear to her chest, and though it was faint, he thought he heard a heartbeat. The next instant, he began pushing on the middle of her chest with both hands, one atop the other. After the first couple of pushes, a decent amount of water came out of her mouth, but then nothing after that. After only 10 to 15 compressions, he tilted her head back and began blowing into her mouth with his mouth completely covering hers. He heard whispers and mutterings behind him. What is he doing? Is he trying to defile her body? You don't suppose he's trying to steal her soul or something, do you? Should we stop him? Maybe we should get the city guard? Ryuji ignored them. He had to if he was going to be quick enough to save her life. Damn it all, CPR classes weren't supposed to be something that he needed to use. Not ever. He had just finished the second set of compressions, and was about to reach for her mouth to begin breathing into her mouth again when she began coughing violently. He rolled her over to her side and sat her up so she could cough it all out. Suddenly there was a hush in the crowd for several seconds, before everyone erupted in cheering and praise. Ryuji made a mental note to himself to fund a public swimming class and to teach CPR to the people of the town. He was just about to start heading back towards the other staircase and his clothing when he got mauled by a crowd of fans. Everyone was crowding in to try talking to him all at once, and it wasn't just the young women but the old women and even the men. Ryuji was just wondering what he was going to do when the town guard arrived and broke the crowd up. A handsome young captain of the guard, with a scar traced across the bridge of his nose, came up to Ryuji and handed him his clothing. After hammering their fists atop each other in this world's version of a handshake, the captain thanked him. It was at that moment that the captain noticed his ID pendant around his neck and popped a hasty bow. "I'm so sorry, lord, I didn't realize that you were nobility." Ryuji shushed him quickly and looked around to see if anybody else had heard. It seemed that there were other guardsmen keeping the people away from them and from the recovering little girl and her elderly guardian. Ryuji looked back to the captain, who seemed a bit bewildered, but at least he wasn't bowing anymore. "Listen, I don't remember my past, so I'd prefer if you didn't mention the whole noble thing, okay? I don't want anybody treating me like I'm somehow different from them just because I have this necklace, and they don't. I may have land somewhere but I don't remember it, so there is probably some other relative in charge of it right now, and that's fine with me. My not being there is probably making them happy too, understand?" The guard captain seemed a little taken aback, but he didn't want to protest because he couldn't get past the idea that he shouldn't talk back to a noble even if it was an order to do just that. In the end, he just nodded, and with that, he finally spoke again. "Understood, Lo, sir. I still wonder, how did you bring a girl back from the dead though? Do you have some kind of divine blessing or something?" Ryuji just had to facepalm at that comment. First, you need to understand that she wasn't dead, just close to dying. Second, what I did anybody could have done if they only knew how. Third, I don't remember how I knew to do that in the first place. All that said, I would like to teach others how to do that, and if somebody started teaching people how to swim, there wouldn't be nearly as much need for it. This little girl nearly drowned, but it's only because she didn't know how to swim, to begin with. The guard captain looked pensive at first. He seemed lost in deep thought, but then he got a bit of a grin on his face. Would your lore you object to the guard teaching people how to swim in our off time? I just thought that it would be a good thing for us to do to protect the people, but... Ryuji could tell that the captain of the town watch was hesitant to ask him about something, so he thought about what might hold the captain back. Then it hit him, they need to be paid for their efforts, or they aren't going to want to do this. Ryuji spoke to the captain with an understanding tone. You have to keep in mind that most of the people that would like to learn are poor, and some will begin to teach others. I wouldn't suggest charging them more than a small copper each to learn, and don't be surprised if the demand is small at first. The demand for swimming lessons should increase after a few successes, and then it will likely taper off after a bit, especially once it gets colder. The captain seemed surprised that Ryuji had so perfectly guessed his concerns, but Ryuji wasn't done there. Then there may be those that want to learn, but just can't seem to scrape together a copper to their name. If your men have somebody like that, perhaps one who always comes around but never will approach them first. If money turns out to be their problem, then bring them to see me. Oh yeah, I'm staying at the Sleeping Tree Inn, but if I decide to go elsewhere, I will let you know where to contact me. If I'm going to be gone for a while, I'll entrust you with a small gold coin, and you can pay your men their fee out of it. Just be sure that the money is going to those that teach swimming lessons to the people. I think that once it's known that the guard can teach you to swim, that there will always be people wanting lessons from now on. You might have to keep a list of people who want them in the future, so you can give the lessons all at once. Ryuji went on to explain the basic principles of CPR, and told the captain that he would teach the guard how to perform that for no charge in the near future. When he called it CPR, the captain looked confused, and so Ryuji thought about it and told him it meant chest press revival. The captain seemed overwhelmed with joy at the prospect of being able to save lives. He told Ryuji that the river claimed about a dozen townsfolk every year, in spite of the stairs, the rails, and the catch poles being placed nearby. All of those seemed to be the work of one old count who was in the guard. Unfortunately, it seemed his interest in helping people avoid dying in the river only came after his own daughter drowned. Ryuji got dressed, simply putting the bathing cloak on over his clothes, and ran to the magic shop. He was expecting to be late, but it turned out that the old man had only just woken up. He looked at his new apprentice like some kind of exotic undersea creature when he said he had been awake for over a candle's pan, which Ryuji almost called an hour again. Seems the old dwarf really wasn't a morning person, so he told Ryuji to just let himself in the mornings and study. He then gave him a copy of the key to his shop, before they went to start on a hearty breakfast of ham and rolls. They topped the rolls with some strange animal paste that turned out to be almost like a jelly, with a flavor somewhat citrusy like the way yuzu smells. After that, it was a hard day of learning the intricacies of magic. The day's lesson started with the basic principles of caster magic. Ryuji learned that the way a caster casts his spells is to dip the tip of a finger into a powder or solution and then infuse magic into that fingertip. That simple action sets the whole process in motion. By infusing the powder or solution on one's fingertip with your magic, it turns it into a sort of magic ink. With this pseudo-ink, the caster is able to draw figures and writing directly in the air in front of them. The caster simply needs to push a bit more magic out to make the finger in question draw, and stopping the flow stops the drawing. That process seems simple enough, but the old dwarf told him that there were those that simply never mastered the control of their magic necessary to be able to draw the figures in the first place. He told Ryuji that he would be practicing that for a while until he had mastered that concept. Also the amount of total mana that a person had set the time limit that a wizard had to draw all of the things needed in order to cast a spell. If you only had a small reserve of mana, then you wouldn't have the time needed to draw a very complex spell out, and you wouldn't be able to advance very far as a wizard. Dorn began getting things together for Ryuji to practice controlling the flow of his magic. While he was doing that, he explained that spells were cast by drawing a magic circle in the air. There were several parts that made up a magic circle. First and most obvious was the circle. Magic theory said that the circle with its unbroken edge with no corners was the barrier that contained all the magic of a spell and channeled it inward to the center. The next part was a geometric figure to be drawn inside the circle, and all of its corners had to touch the edge of the circle but not go outside it. For this part, being at least mildly artistic was essential. Many would-be wizards failed when it came to an inability to draw a decently straight circle or the failure to draw the figure inside of the bounds of the circle. Ryuji breathed a mental sigh of relief, because geometry and art were some of his favorite courses in school. Next came the symbols. There were certain symbols that represented the magic elements. One or more of those would be used in the center of the geometric figure and the very center of the circle. These symbols were the focus of the spell, and all of the spell's power would be focused through those symbols and thus through those elements. The other symbols would then be drawn on the lines of the geometric figure inside the circle. This last detail differed from summoner magic in that a summoner had to draw their symbols on the curving edge of the casting circle, not the flat lines of the geometric pattern inside it. The writing besides the symbols in the center were descriptions of how the spell was to function. In that way, it was a bit like programming a computer. You had to set ideas and bounds for the function of the spell in the form of script, drawn inside the circle. There was one exception to this inside the circle rule. At the points where the geometric figure touched the edge of the circle, one glyph could be inscribed per point. These glyphs or symbols were broad control ideas and set the course for everything that would be drawn on the lines near it. Ryuji figured it would be kind of like indexing tabs in a notebook or file cabinet. The symbol was there to draw all the attention for that particular subject to that area. Again, caster magic differed from summoner magic because the outside symbols in summoner magic were to tie together two subjects divided by the corners of the geometric pattern in the circle. That was where the lesson on magic theory ended for the time, as Dorn set the prepared materials in front of him. It was just a bowl of ground-up stone powder, made from one of the least expensive kinds of stone, and a damp cloth rag. Dorn told him that for practicing magic control, he could simply dip his finger in water, but the results would be a little harder to see in the air in front of him until he got the hang of infusing enough magic into it. He said that once you got the flow of magic right, the whole thing would glow a uniform color and brightness. Until then, it would be too dim to see with water or air, and fire was too dangerous to mess with like that. The obvious choice was earth, and for the practice, with earth, he could simply have stuck a finger in dirt. The old guy told him that he could easily have gone outside and scooped up a bowl of dirt to practice with, but he wanted to demonstrate the process of making the reagents that a wizard uses, and it gave him longer to explain anyway. That was fine with Ryuji, he was really having fun. Ryuji had the ground-up rock powder for practicing his lesson, and the rag was for cleaning the remainder off after each attempt. Dorn explained that this was important because the remaining powder on his finger would already be slightly infused with magic. If he then dipped his finger back into the powder, then there would be some of the powder that would be charged with more magic than the rest, and the result would be that the spell would become more unstable. Ryuji was fascinated by the whole process, and every part of the lesson was of complete interest to him. He was instructed to dip his finger into the powder and then try to feel his mana flowing like he did the day before. Once he felt it, he was to try pushing only a small amount into the tip of his finger and out into the powder, and then the challenging part would come. At that point, he had to keep concentrating on his mana and push a steady small trickle through the powder as he drew figures in the air. Ryuji tried, and his first dozen or so attempts failed utterly. After that, he had one time that he got a good long stripe to form a glowing brown in the air. Due to getting excited, he kept botching it for a while after that. Eventually, he got to where he could feel the flow going through his finger and even feel the flow going through the powder. Once he felt that just once, he grasped the principle and began writing in the air. He practiced infusing more or less mana into the same set of kanji, those that formed his name. He found that there was a certain minimum threshold of magic that had to be provided to make the words form, and that the less magic in them the shorter they stayed formed in the air. So that was why a certain base reserve of mana was required to form certain tiers of magic. Ryuji had moved on past that and was trying to write increasingly long sentences in the air and seeing how long he could make them based on the amount of mana that he infused into them. It was during one of those attempts that he heard a whistle behind his back and turned to find a wide-eyed Dorn staring in fascination at the still-floating script. Ryuji was mildly embarrassed that he had left the words "Taro rode the turtle to the dragon palace" floating in the air, but then he remembered that nobody but him could read it. Dorn shook his head in disbelief, before speaking. "Well, I'll be a goblin's uncle. I knew the Yi had a lot o' mana, but ta think ye could reach this level o' control after only a few candles pans o' practice. It took me near on 4-8 days o' practice ta do why ye did in just a day. I'd be a regret-tin if I'd passed up the chance ta be teachin' ye. At this rate, ye'll be a first-rate wizard in an 808 days' time or maybe even less. The idea had occurred to me before, but I be thinkin' the Yi was already a wizard. Ye claim ye canna be rememberin' your past, aye? Well, what if'n ye was a wizard before? Ye wouldna be knowin' it before tryin', aye? Maybe this be just the thin ta be gettin' your memory back. I donna be makin' no promises now ye hear? But hey, just maybe." Ryuji had to nod along. He didn't know anything about the past in this world, but he suspected that the Yuma or god or whatever he was had created his body that day in the forest. Therefore it was unlikely that he had ever been a wizard. But that still left the possibility that the old dwarf was right. What if he was some kind of parasite, a body-taking ghost that was imprisoning the rightful occupant of this body? It was a somewhat scary thought that gave him a shiver. They decided to take a break for lunch since it was that time and Ryuji had made so much progress. They had a simple lunch of leftovers from breakfast. The whole time they were taking their lunch break, Dorn kept glancing at Ryuji with looks of mixed appraisal and pride. They covered several topics while chatting, but Ryuji could tell that there was some topic that the old dwarf really wanted to ask about. Finally, the topic got close enough that Dorn thought it might sound natural to ask what had been on his mind. As they were discussing magic script after the meal, Dorn casually asked about the writing that he had seen Ryuji using for his magic studies. "So, that's what he's been so wound up about." Ryuji adopted a pensive and apologetic expression before he answered. "I hate to say it, but I really don't know what to tell you about it. I know how to read and write it and I've been able to since waking up in the forest, but I can't say much more about it. It seems to be a really complicated script, but I'm not sure where in the world it comes from." The truth that he couldn't admit was that it didn't come from this world at all. Dorn seemed to deflate a little bit, but he got over it fairly quick. To Dorn, it was probably a mystery to be solved, like some kind of ancient long-lost script from one of those forgotten tomes he was telling Ryuji about. He would probably go looking for some trace of it if he thought that it might contain some value academically. Ryuji didn't mind, and there was always the chance that he might actually find some similar script in use somewhere in the world. Perhaps Ryuji wasn't the first Japanese person to be transplanted here. After lunch, Dorn began explaining more about the theory behind magic circles. Apparently, he felt that Ryuji possessed a pretty sizable amount of mana and had a remarkable amount of control over it. It was for that reason that Dorn decided to proceed right along without worrying about more mana control lessons. He just told Ryuji to get some dirt or even water and practice on his own. The topic he decided to broach was the tiers of spells and how they were to be arranged. It turned out that the tier of a spell was easy to tell at a glance by simply looking at the number of rings it had. The most common type of spell actually being second tier. Dorn explained that by asking how much water he thought could be pushed through a small hole. The larger the hole, the more water could fit through at once, but the larger the hole, the more water was needed to make a decent stream that would fill the entire hole up. If a person didn't have enough mana, then there wouldn't be enough to power a larger spell of a higher tier. In the same way, the simplest spells tended to be too constricting for most wizards to use well. It was, however, important for mana control to learn the first-tier spells. Also, they could be cast quicker than someone could cast a second-tier spell. The reason for this was a simple matter of the spell's complexity. The higher the tier, the more complex by nature and the harder to draw. However, some wizards became adept at focusing larger amounts of mana through first-tier spells and were very quick about it. The reasoning in Ryuji's mind was like pushing a lot of water through a tiny hole. If you could keep the water focused and keep the pressure from escaping, you could cut metal with water. Ryuji began wondering about the practicality of that, and his mind was busy wandering until Doran got his attention with a slap on the back. "Pay attention, youngin'. I'll be minnin' me own grave before I'll teach those the don wanna be learnin'. Don't ya be lettin' your mind slip. That's important in all aspects o' magic from learnin' ta castin'. And don't ya be forgettin' the bad things y'all be happenin' if'n ye let a spell get the better o' ye." Ryuji made a mental note to never let his mind wander when he was learning or casting magic. He had heard it was possible for some of the more elite thinkers in school to keep their minds so well focused that they could keep a running conversation with their friends and still retain every word of a lecture and repeat it verbatim. He decided it might be a good idea to try learning that skill. The lecture continued with the practicality of certain geometric patterns for making spells. Ryuji hadn't considered it, but a triangle was the simplest geometric pattern you could put into a spell circle. It had the least number of sides that you could use, at just 3. Only when you went to the second tier, the sides of the triangle just barely met the edges of a second concentric circle on the edges. A square would work for a first-tier spell of slightly greater complexity, and a pentagon slightly greater still, but there was a limit to the complexity that you could add to a first-tier spell. Ryuji finally realized something that would be obvious to anybody gifted in geometry: you couldn't use any of the simple shapes for a higher-tier spell except a triangle. A triangle could only be used up to a second-tier spell. After that, the third concentric ring wouldn't touch, because the spacing of the rings had to be even. The explanation took a lot longer because Doran had to explain his way around concepts like concentricity, which had words for them in Japan that, it would appear, didn't exist in this world. Ryuji tried asking Doran about the word parallel and the word concentric, but the old dwarf drew a blank, saying he had never heard the words before. Once he was listening, most of the words coming from his mouth didn't sound anything like Japanese, and those 2 words he had used were pronounced in proper Japanese. In that way, Ryuji was able to come to the conclusion that if he tried, he could speak Japanese, and also that some words just didn't translate. Resuming the lecture, Doran explained that only shapes with lines that crossed themselves, like pentagrams, would work for the higher-tier spells. The exception to the rule was that you could draw multiple simple shapes inside the spell circle. Ryuji realized it was like 2 triangles making a Star of David from the Jewish religion. With the now more complex shape, the space in the center would be tighter and could touch all the parallel concentric rings. With the explanation out of the way, Doran handed him a thin leather-bound tome and told him to open it. It was full of circles with geometric patterns inside them. At the bottom of each page was some text, and some of the patterns had text near them, but Ryuji couldn't read any of it. Doran told him to begin practicing tracing the shapes. He said having a basic feel for the shapes was important, and once he felt confident enough with a shape that he thought he could reproduce it, then he could try drawing it with the powder and magic. Ryuji was worried and asked if that wouldn't trigger an incomplete spell. Doran explained that without the symbol in the center, the spell had nothing to channel power through. It was like describing a hole without actually opening it. Doran told him that he would be practicing all of his scripts for the outer parts of the spell before he ever wrote the first elemental glyph. That was apparently the way that spells were written. A wizard would start with the geometric patterns to set the tier and complexity of the spell. Next came the description symbols that would control the power once it was applied. After that, the central glyphs were written in, which was like finally opening the hole. Then the last step was for the wizard to push the correct amount of mana through the spell, much like pushing the water through the hole you created. It all made sense to Ryuji. He began tracing the patterns in the book, and Doran left him to the task. After a few minutes, Ryuji got bored with the tracing and decided to try drawing them for real. He dipped his finger in the powder and applied the measuring techniques he had learned earlier. Using centering techniques he had learned in geometry, he tried drawing the circles, and it wasn't too long till he got the basic form of the circles pretty close to perfect. It was at one point when he messed up a little and his hand shook that he got a strange wobble in his circle. Looking at the finished circle, he got mad, and with his fingers still in the circle, he flared his mana unintentionally. To his utter surprise, the circle glowed brighter and straightened out. What remained was a perfect circle, in a slightly off brown, the same color as the ground-up rock. Ryuji was amazed that he had figured this nifty little trick out. He tried it several more times and discovered that if the shape was roughly circular it would work, but if it diverged too far it failed and the drawing dissipated. The circle would immediately fail and dissipate if there were any corners in the edge of the circle, so he knew that you had to be a little careful, but not all that much. Ryuji began wondering why he wasn't taught this if it was so handy. It was a little after that he decided to try the same trick with a triangle, but that immediately failed. He figured it must be the corner points. If he pushed mana into that, it would become a breaking point. He discovered that he could draw concentric circles, but it would only work on the innermost that he had drawn. He could, however, fix them one at a time, before drawing the next smaller one. Even more nifty was the way the spacing automatically became even and the circles became parallel when he flared mana into the central circle. It was while he was practicing the technique with concentric rings that he suddenly began getting queasy and lightheaded. He went into the back and told Doran he was feeling sick, and the old dwarf asked how long he had been practicing his drawing. He said he had been working on that pretty much the whole time, and Doran told him to feel of his mana reserves. Ryuji was shocked to find that he was very low on mana. He figured he only had maybe a tenth of his total capacity left. Doran asked him to demonstrate what he had been doing once, and he could go home for the day. Ryuji decided he would watch what his mana did while he was drawing the circles. Everything was fine at first. Ryuji made a pretty acceptable outer circle, and he didn't feel that it needed correcting. When he drew the next of the 3 intended rings though, it wasn't quite symmetrical. That's when he flared his mana to straighten it out. Suddenly he felt queasy again, and he could actually see his mana flood out in that split second of flare. Now he understood why it wasn't a common practice. The simple act of flaring his mana used a disproportionately large amount of mana. After Doran helped him to his feet, he slowly began to feel a little better after a few minutes. Doran told him that he was using the same amount of mana or more to straighten the circles that he would to activate a spell of mid-tier. Ryuji was impressed with the amount of mana that he had, but now he knew exactly why Doran didn't tell him to do that. He said goodbye for the day and left the magic shop. He then made his way back to the inn, intending to go straight upstairs for a short rest. Teresa stopped him first and handed him something that had been delivered for him. The sight of new sets of clothing made him feel ever so much better. He then made his way upstairs for a rest. After a short nap, he awakened and felt very refreshed. He decided to go clean up and got a basin full of the now cold water from outside the privy. After washing off in his room, he was finally able to change clothing for the first time since coming to this world. The new clothes were remarkably well tailored and fit him perfectly, with just enough room in them to move freely. Ryuji then made his way back downstairs, where Karen was waiting for him with a steaming plate of pork roast. This was something very special because meat like this was expensive, and all the more so if you were going to serve it to all of your customers. The vegetables and bread all looked to be freshly heated, and the whole entree left him practically drooling. Ryuji asked Karen about the occasion, but she wouldn't give him a straight answer. The truth was that he was teasing her, because he could easily tell that they had delivered her cream-colored dress since she was wearing it. She was also wearing the earrings, and they complemented both her complexion and the dress nicely. Karen sheepishly sat her plate down opposite his at the table, and the blush was back on her face. They enjoyed a leisurely meal together with the obligatory jealous stares from both male and female patrons, mixed with quite a few sly grins. Among those in the grinning category was the old owner of the inn, Teresa. She stood near the end of the bar, watching approvingly. After going back upstairs, Ryuji went back to his room and made sure to lock the door. After he had lit the lamp and settled in, he began filling the satchel with copper coins again. To his surprise, the coin pouch now dispensed 3 copper coins at a time. His goal of filling the satchel finished, he thought about going to bed, but he had taken a nap earlier and wasn't really sleepy. Ryuji decided to practice his magic circles with water this time. Much to his surprise, it was easier to control the flow of mana into the water and thus through the circle it created. He realized it was probably a bad idea to try using his mana so soon, and dreading another headache, he took a look at his mana reserves. That's when he received another shock. His mana reserves were full again. He just shrugged it off and kept practicing. After a while, he got bored of drawing circles and stars in the air with water. He decided he would go ahead and log the day's lessons while they were still fresh in his memories. It probably took over an hour for him to write down everything that he had been taught that day. Afterward, as he was looking back over it, he was glad he had decided to write it down while it was fresh. He was amazed at how much he had learned in one day. After that, he decided it was time for bed. Ryuji jumped out of bed. He had been having a nightmare about all of his friends dying. He couldn't recall any of the details, and he was glad. Happy that it was only a dream, he got out of bed and prepared for the day. After leaving the sleeping tree inn, it was off to the money changer. Shone, the teenage money changer from before, was available, so Ryuji sat at his desk. When he sat down, the boy looked very astonished to see him back so soon and had something like a cornered animal look. Ryuji figured that he suspected he was about to be accused of shortchanging, so he moved to dispel the boy's fears. He dropped the same heavy satchel on the desk and asked for the shopping assortment like before. The boy looked visibly relieved and rushed off to get his money changed. As before, Ryuji left him a small silver as a tip before exiting the money changers. As Ryuji approached the magic shop, he could hear Dorn in the kitchen and quickly went to buy some bread from Lisbeth for them to share. Dorn eyed Ryuji's new clothing and especially his new sword suspiciously, but didn't say anything. They enjoyed their breakfast and then it was time for lessons to begin. Dorn went to a shelf behind the counter and pulled out a small stack of books and sat them atop the counter before instructing Ryuji to sit on the stool. Dorn flipped open the first of the books and sat it in front of Ryuji before continuing. "This'll be watchery gonna be a learnin' for the next little bit. This sin's a book ta be teaching ye ta read and write the language round here. It's got a bunch o' drawin's o' stuff with the words for on the same page. If'n ye be unsure watchery lookin' at or what the word fair it be just ask. In the same time ye can be mind in me store. I know ye see I be accountin', I seen ye checkin' your change for the book ye bought. Ye'll be a learnin' ta read and ye'll be a needin' ta practice your writin'. I be thinkin' that I could part with another blank book if'n it'll help ye learn. Just you be mind in your lessons, aye? After ye be learnin' your words, ye can be readin' the rest o' those books. Those'll be the magic glyph ye'll be needin' to be learnin' to write your magic circles with. I could be a teachin' ya, but I have a feelin' ye be pretty good at readin' and writin', just not in this language. I been puttin' off doin' a bit o' magic research for a while now and I be figurin' that since e'll be able to mind the store it's as good a time as ever, aye? Now, get ye busy." With that Dorn left Ryuji to his reading studies. It was a strange language system and took a bit of time before Ryuji figured the style out. At first, Ryuji was having a really hard time figuring the language system out because it was very different from Japanese. After a bit of study, he finally concluded that the language was written somewhat like a Western-style language where the sounds were grouped into vowels and consonants, but there didn't appear to be enough of the second group and there was a third group. Finally, he figured out that they were grouped into hard consonants and soft ones. That discovery came just before lunch. Ryuji asked if he could go give his mind a break and get lunch. Dorn agreed that might be a good idea. Trying to force too much knowledge at once could create a mental block, better to take a quick break every now and then. With that Ryuji was off to the market plaza. The first place that Ryuji went was Lisbeth's storefront. Ryuji asked her about where she baked her bread and she told him that she had a kiln in her home. He asked her if it wasn't too much work for her. She told him that she had 2 daughters who lived with her and they all baked bread together but that the 2 girls sold bread at different stalls in other parts of the city. Then he asked her whether she had a lot of bread contracts like she did with Teresa. After the first few questions, she began to get suspicious. "Youngin', why are you asking me all these questions? What are you after?" Ryuji became a little sheepish after being directly confronted about his questioning, and he realized he had been about as subtle as a sledgehammer. Nothing left to do but press ahead and just be perfectly frank. I wanted to invest in a few businesses, and I've been wondering for days why bread as good as yours isn't coming from a bakery. I was hoping I might be able to invest in your business and make it grow a bit. Of course, I do hope to make a profit from the investment, but I really think that your bread is worth investing in. Lisbeth seemed bewildered for a moment, but after a moment she began to get angry. Look, young'un, I don't need somebody else to tell me how to run my business, and I don't need anybody coming along and taking all my profits either. Besides, the amount of money you're talking about would take longer to pay back than I have left to live. Besides, it's not like you can just put in a new store without getting the approval of the local nobles. Out of all the things wrong with what you said, making the nobility angry is probably the worst idea in the lot. The way she said the first two was in a quiet angry tone, but the last was so hushed it almost seemed conspiratorial. Ryuji just had to smile about the way she said that part as he considered the consequences of what he was about to do. Finally coming to a decision, he reached into his shirt and pulled out the pendant just enough for her to see before quickly dropping it back in place. Actually, the last one is the only one that I don't think would cause me any real problems. The first two items you mention are much more important to me. Her eyes went wide as Ryuji went on in a mild conversational tone to avoid suspicion. I have to admit that I'm a little offended that you think I would act that way. I can't claim to know how anyone else would do things, but that just isn't me. However, I won't try to force you if you're suspicious of me or my motives. And as far as the whole paying back thing goes, I never intended to be paid back. I wanted to get a small source of income for several generations. I wouldn't try to get much from it, and I would always be ready to invest more if needed, but if that isn't something you want, then please forget I asked, and hopefully our relationship can remain the same as before, young lady. Before they could conclude their business, another customer came up and interrupted their conversation. After her other business was concluded, Lisbeth thought about it for a moment and then looked at Ryuji again. If you're serious about what you said, you'll give me a little time, let me think about it and ask my daughters about it. I'll let you know what they said and give you my decision tomorrow. Will that be acceptable? Ryuji smiled warmly. Of course. No need to feel pressured. If you or your daughters don't want to do it, then don't worry about it. It's just an offer, not a demand or anything like that. If you still haven't decided tomorrow, let me know, and I'll check back with you on it the next time I come to get bread, okay? After that, Ryuji bought a couple butter loaves and went to the skewer vendor from before. The young dog Beastfolk boy from before wasn't there, but an older one who somewhat resembled him was. Ryuji asked about the boy and found that they were brothers. It seemed that the younger brother was sick and the older was minding the shop instead of hunting for more meat. He then told Ryuji that he was really worried about his brother, but they couldn't afford to hire a priest, much less a mercenary with a blessing. Ryuji thought it through and asked how much one would cost. It turned out that getting a priest to come to heal someone was usually one large and one small silver. Ryuji whistled at that. While it wasn't much at all to him, he did a bit of quick calculation in his head and realized that at 2 small copper per skewer it would take the sale of 288 skewers to make that much money. How close are you to that? The guy just hung his head and shook it. You don't even have enough meat for 288 skewers, do you? The guy looked very confused by that number for several seconds, then he started counting on his fingers and Ryuji nodded at him. Yeah, that's how many it would take to make that much. You don't have that much meat, do you? The guy looked really depressed and again hung his head before shaking it negatively. Ryuji smirked a tiny bit before continuing. What if I just gave you the money, and then the two of you work for me for a while? Ryuji gave his words a moment to sink in before he went on. It would be a loan, of course. I would give you a small gold right now, and then you would have enough money that the two of you could take a couple days off until he could be treated and still buy the meat you needed to get back to work after. I would then come by each day and collect the day's earnings and leave you two enough to pay your bills and buy your necessities like food. I will keep a record of exactly how much you two have paid until you pay off one small gold and one small silver. Deal? The dog Beastfolk guy behind the meat skewer stand looked confused for a second, but he began working through the math in his head. After a minute or two, he locked Ryuji with a look of suspicion. You would only be making one small silver. You would be okay with that? Also, how do I know we could trust you? It seems like too good of a deal to be trusted. Ryuji smiled at him and just waited a moment, but not long enough to be awkward. What would you say if I were to ask for double my money back? You would call me a greedy crook, and rightfully so. Would it make you take my offer? I bet you would turn it down. I don't want a bunch of money from you. If you had a bunch of money, you wouldn't need my help, to begin with. Ryuji looked over the stall a moment before continuing. What I want isn't the money, but that doesn't mean I'm doing it just because I'm a nice guy. I have certain people that I want to be able to tell that I have a hand in several local businesses. Besides, what's the alternative? You watch your brother get worse and maybe die. The Beastfolk guy looked away with an expression of resignation before answering. Okay, you have a point. You said you would keep a record of how much we had paid. Will we be able to see the records? How much are you going to leave us to live on? Ryuji negotiated with the guy for a couple minutes before he was satisfied. Then Ryuji tore a page out of his new letter practicing book and pulled out the ink and pen. He had to have the guy write the contract, but he played that off as him not being able to sneak in any hidden wording. They both signed it before Ryuji pulled out one small gold coin and handed it over. He got his 2 skewers and told the guy to sell all of his stock before taking his time off to help his brother, and the money wouldn't be counted, that the contract would start when they got back to work. Ryuji then spent a while going around to several other businesses and making contracts with them. It was rather awkward always having them write a contract, but he played it off well and vowed he would study and learn the language fast, not just to do writing but also to continue learning his magic. The others were mostly just loans like the skewer stall, but there was one exception. Lastly, Ryuji made his way to the back corner of the plaza, where the old gray cat greeted him like an old friend. Well, if it isn't my favorite customer. Here to purchase something else, don't tell me you need more pouches already? Ryuji laughed it off and explained. No, no pouches. I was, however, hoping to get another satchel. I really wanted one that was bigger, maybe twice as thick even, with a reinforced bottom and maybe even extra leather over the seams to make sure it could hold the heaviest thing I might want to carry without fear of tearing out a seam. Also, if I could get it in a nice green or maybe a blue. The old cat Beastfolk thought about it for a couple seconds before nodding in thought. Maybe you could tell me more about what you had in mind. It just might be a really popular idea. Would you mind if I made a couple extra and tried selling them as well? Of course, I would make yours first. Ryuji nodded a moment with a smirk on his face. The guy was a great salesman. He wasn't too pushy, but he was motivated. He had a family to support. The old cat had told him part of what he wanted to know, but not everything, so Ryuji then launched into a series of questions about the business. It seemed that the old cat's 2 daughters and the older children helped sew the leather goods during the day. The husbands had labor jobs around town and the old man ran the stall. Even the younger children contributed to their household with chores. Ryuji made him an offer. What would you say if I told you I wanted to open a leather goods store and sell your items there? Well, actually, I would buy the property and I would have you work there selling the goods. I would make sure to get a place big enough that part could be the store while the rest could be your family's new home. What do you think? The guy enthusiastically agreed without hesitation. Ryuji asked if he had any doubts, and the old guy said he had been doubting the appearance of a rich sun elf walking around shopping in this plaza. He went on to say that if such a guy were looking for businesses to buy out or something like that, then it would make a lot more sense. Ryuji just had to laugh at that and told the old guy he would catch up to him later. He claimed it was so he could see the leatherworking area, but the truth was he wanted to make sure that he got a place that had a lot more room than their house. He certainly didn't want to squeeze them any tighter together. After parting with the old cat, Ryuji headed back to the magic shop. He knew he had taken a little too long getting back, but when he told Dorn he was back, the old dwarf didn't seem concerned in the least. He sat himself at the counter and prepared for a long evening of reading practice. He had the hang of the different letter sounds after the morning study. The people called them glyphs instead of letters, or at least that's the word his brain heard Dorn refer to them by. The jump from sounding out glyphs to sounding out words was an easy one. His next hurdle came shortly after resuming his studies of the Tso language that evening. Ryuji couldn't make sense of the placement of the words. He could sound them out, but they didn't seem to make sentences as far as he could tell. Finally, he realized that everything on a page, or at least in any part of the page, was dedicated to one subject. It was such a bizarre concept that he couldn't wrap his mind around it until he recalled the way that the people actually talked. He realized that the words he heard and what they said didn't always match up. These people didn't talk in sentences, they talked in paragraphs. Each paragraph would have the subject stated once. They also used verbs before the object each time. It was so confusing that Ryuji was having a really tough time with it. It didn't help that they didn't talk in tenses, and instead, everything was always in the infinitive form. After making very slow progress, Ryuji finally managed to comprehend the meaning of one page of a tome. It was everything he could do just to follow the flow of the writing. One page took him hours to work out. When he finally finished, he had a headache and looked up. That's when he noticed it was getting darker out. He told Dorn he was going for the evening, and the dwarf asked him about his progress. He explained what he had figured out, but he couldn't explain why it was so strange to him very well. He left the shop and hurried back to the plaza, and the old cat had already packed up his shop for the night. He was just standing there waiting for Ryuji to arrive. Ryuji came over and apologized for taking so long. "Sorry, I got caught up in what I had to do today. I didn't mean to keep you waiting. Shall we go see your leather sewing facilities? I may be better able to explain the bag I want if I can give some examples also." The old cat just smiled and nodded at him before hurrying off towards his home. He was hurrying, but that wouldn't be apparent to anyone who didn't know him, since his age was slowing him so considerably. He was certainly hurrying though, because he had some great news for his family tonight. The only worry he had was that the meal wouldn't be fit for his guest. By the time they arrived, Ryuji was thoroughly lost. One good thing was that he could easily see even though it was getting fairly dark. The house that the old man approached seemed entirely too small for the number of people he claimed were living there. Ryuji was wondering if he misunderstood the situation a bit and simply followed after. As soon as the old man opened the door, Ryuji could see almost every member of the household. He realized that the old guy wasn't kidding about the lack of privacy. As Ryuji walked in behind the old guy, he was having a hard time imagining the sleeping arrangements in there, that's how cramped it was. As soon as everyone spotted Old Man Gato, they started to greet him and then froze when they spotted Ryuji behind him. One of the young children seemed a bit scared and was the first to speak. Grandpa," after that she just pointed. The old cat was about to speak when one of the men stood and smiled a questioning smile before demanding an explanation. "Gato, who is that? Why are you bringing people home with you when we already can't feed the people here?" Ryuji felt fairly embarrassed about the whole thing, but a couple things solidified in his mind. First, there was no way to go wrong in getting the building. This house was barely any bigger than a studio apartment and there were 9 of them in there. This was terrible, but he was careful not to let pity show on his face. He definitely didn't want to look as though he were looking down on them. Then he noticed that there was even a portion of the living space taken up with work materials in progress, even if they had been pushed aside. The old cat, Gato, looked a little annoyed with the younger, but he didn't let it color his voice. He was trying so hard to make this work. "This young elf lord is the repeat customer I've been speaking about. He came here to look at the house and show us the type of bag he wants. He also made a grand proposal that I think we should take him up on." As the old guy said the last words, he turned to look at Ryuji, who stepped forward fully into the room and closed the door behind him. "My name is Ryuji, nice to meet you all. I came, as Mr. Gatto said, to explain the make of the satchel I was hoping that you could make for me. Also, as Mr. Gatto said, I have a proposition for you all to think on a bit. Ryuji looked over the room full of cat beastfolk and couldn't help but marvel again at how very fantastic this world really was. Still, even as he enjoyed the scene of a family of catfolk, their scruffiness struck home and he realized that they were truly impoverished. I want to open a storefront. I was telling Mr. Gatto, I would like to open a leatherworking shop to sell your products. I also hope to find a place big enough for sale to have the store in part of it and be able to move the workers into the other part. I was hoping I could hire all of you to work there as well. As he said his spiel, the occupants of the room all looked at one another in apparent bewilderment. Their ears and whiskers flickered and the ears of the one young man sat almost flat against his head. Ryuji didn't take that to be a good sign. He didn't reach for his sword, but he tensed his arm momentarily. The young man simply looked at the older as if for confirmation. All of a sudden, the room erupted with talking as everyone began voicing their questions and concerns all at once. Ryuji was bombarded by questions, but the ones that he could pick out were, "Are you sure? Why yes, and do you mean all of us?" Since he caught those three, he decided to answer those first. He held up his hand and they all fell silent after a moment. "I assure you that this isn't a joke or something. I have an interest in opening a few businesses, and your work has caught my attention. I want to sell your leatherwork, and I can see that this place is clearly not suited to keeping up with the demands of a full storefront. I want you all to stay in the store and become my employees." Ryuji noticed a discrepancy, his speech had suddenly reverted to Japanese on the last word. He also noticed that the last word had left them all confused, so he tried again. Employee, the word still came out in clear Japanese, so he tried differently. Workers, this time everyone seemed to get it. The response shocked him a tad, but he tried to hide it as best possible to hurry things along. "Your lordship? Why would you want us as your servants? You may lose customers because we're beastfolk." "Are you sure?" The young woman looked terrified, but Ryuji smiled at her disarmingly. "That was my plan, but are you saying there is something wrong with you? I see 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 hands, 2 legs, 1 nose, and 1 mouth. You all seem to have the right number of things where they should be, and you all look capable enough. You speak the same language for the most part. I guess that maybe you're saying that you couldn't sell stuff because of what people might say to you? If that's the case, I guess I could hire a guard at the Mercenaries Guild. Actually, that's probably a good idea anyway." The look of shock and realization was priceless, but he wasn't done yet. "Oh good, I see you haven't started cooking. I would rather not waste time in our meeting, so why don't you all come with me and I'll get you all fed while we talk." The looks on their faces were just great, but he felt a sense of urgency because it was a bit later than he was expecting. He turned and was about to open the door when one of the women spoke up. "What about the children, my lord? We haven't fed them yet?" Ryuji gave her a puzzled look. "I meant for you to bring them with you." "Are you certain, my lord? I'll be hiring all of you, so why wouldn't I include them?" The young woman that he assumed was the mother of some of the children looked relieved. They left in a group with Old Man Gatto in the lead since he was the slowest. The men carried the children as they bustled along, drawing a few gazes. For the most part, they seemed unconcerned because they were all too excited. When they arrived at the inn, Teresa was in the lobby and looked up from the table she was serving. A look of bewilderment washed across her face for a moment before she recognized Ryuji in the group. "Oh, well, I'll be. Made a few friends, I see. Well, I guess you'll have to wait a few minutes for some of the other guests to clear out of some of the seats at the larger tables." She pointed to a couple of the larger tables near the rear of the dining area, and Ryuji saw a few people there. The guests in question all seemed to be looking at them and almost as one they grabbed their food and moved to other tables. Ryuji was a tad puzzled before realizing that people generally had a dim view of beastfolk here. Ryuji shrugged and waved the group over to the seats and made a point of giving a friendly thanks to the people that had vacated their seats. The family settled in and a moment later Teresa bustled over to take their order. Well lad, you certainly don't do things by half measures, do you? So, what'll it be? I can get everyone the regular supper, or I could start a roast for the table? Oh, but the roast will take a while to cook. We'll save ordering the roast for celebrating at a later date. For now, can you bring us 9 of the supper meals with some sweet bread after the meal? Teresa nodded, and a few minutes later both she and Karen came out of the kitchen bearing trays of a wonderful-smelling stew, along with some kind of meat strips on another plate. They also had a pile of regular and sweet bread on plates. Karen winked at him as she set all the plates from her tray onto the table. The family of cat Beastfolk seemed hesitant till Ryuji gestured for them to eat. They all began to hesitantly try the food while Ryuji thanked Teresa and Karen. He paid for the meal with a couple silver and told Teresa to just keep the extra. The older members of the family looked like their eyes were going to pop out. After everyone had had a chance to get some food and then Ryuji moved on to the topic he wanted to discuss. I was a bit curious, what are the reasons that you and everyone else have those stands instead of stores? Is it just money? Several of them looked at one another before the young woman from earlier spoke up. The money needed to buy a license for a stall is only 5 small copper every 8 days, but for a store, it's 2 small silver per year. We might be able to get that much money, but the amount needed to buy the building is way too much. I've heard that some people on the square get really lucky and are able to eventually move into stores in the city somewhere. That was never an option for us, because the stall doesn't make that much. That is, if they would give a license to Beastfolk. Ryuji was puzzled. Why do people here seem to hate Beastfolk? Gato answered. We Beastfolk have always been looked down on. When he showed no intention of continuing, Ryuji smiled at them disarmingly. Well, why don't we see if we can change that then? I need people to work in my store. I have nothing against anyone who doesn't have bad intentions. I'll get the license, but I would like to stay out of the day-to-day business as much as possible. I'll just handle the bookkeeping behind the scenes and make sure that you have enough money to keep the store running smoothly. I suspect that at first, the store will need more money than it will make, but that's okay with me as long as it makes money in the long run. As a bonus, you'll be improving the way people look at Beastfolk. They all looked leery of a trap as if he had some hidden intentions, which he did of course, so he went on in a conspiratorial tone while leaning forward. Okay, let me level with you all. At these words, the adults all looked at one another as if they knew this was too good to be true. The truth is, I came here with a lot of money in a bag. I don't remember who I was, but I do remember a few details about my past. One of the things I remember is that nobles will always sniff out a pile of money and try to find a reason to make it their own. I need to spend a bunch of my money on a way to make money a little at a time. That's why I've been staying here instead of in the richer parts of town. I don't want to lose what I have any more than anybody else. The look of understanding and relief was blatantly visible on all their faces. He hated lying to them, but if a little white lie would put them all at ease, it was better than them not trusting him. Alright, so now you know the truth. I need something from you. I need scouts and informants in the city. I need you all to listen to any gossip about anything that seems remotely important and tell me about it. I need you all to keep me informed so I don't trip into a situation that could have been avoided if I had only known, because I can't remember much of anything. Aside from that, I need you all to go find a place that would work for the store and get me the information on who owns it or who I need to talk to about buying it. The younger looking of the women raised her tabby-colored paw-like hand, so he directed all his attention to her. To buy any property inside the walls of the city, you have to talk to the Baron's tax officer in the South Nobles district. Now that I think about it, we're almost right there now. When you go to the end of the street and turn right, it's just past the stables, on the right. Thank you. So, what do you say? Will you help me? I'll make it worth your efforts, I promise. After looking at each other, they all began to nod one after the other. Then the younger of the men spoke up. If you're hiring them for the store, will you need a guard or two? He looked so desperate Ryuji could practically read his mind. Yes, I will hire all of you. But it would probably be best if you kept your current jobs going until I have the new storefront bought and everything is settled for opening the store." They all cheered, and he bought mugs of ale for them and anyone else who asked. It was a great night. He had several LS too. His body was grown, so why not, right? He vaguely remembered being helped to his room by Karen, and he could almost swear that she kissed him, but he probably dreamed that. That next morning was horrible. Ryuji felt sick, his head was pounding, and the sun was way too bright. He realized this was a hangover from drinking the night before and swore he would never drink again. After barely making it to the privy at the end of the hall, the smell helped him empty the last of the ale from his stomach. He then washed up and set and got into a new set of clothing since his other clothes smelled like they were dipped in ale and left to sour. He went downstairs to thank Karen for helping him to bed and found that a couple of the cat Beastfolk from last night were still there, including Gato. He went over to them, but Teresa waved him over and insisted they could sleep it off. He thanked her and gave her a small silver to cover his tab and the inconvenience. As usual, she tried to protest it was too much, but he was out the door before she had the chance. Ryuji went by Lisbeth's stand and had a surprise waiting for him. Lisbeth's daughters were both there waiting for him. At first, they looked mad and he figured that they thought that he was pulling their chains. To keep things from going in that direction, he spoke first, going straight to Lisbeth. "So young lady, have you come to a decision? I may need your help finding a place that would work, because I admit I don't know what kind of building you would need for a bakery. So, how about it? Oh, and please introduce me to these other gorgeous young ladies beside you." Lisbeth just smiled and shook her head before smirking at the two bewildered-looking daughters. "See what I mean? Be careful of this golden-tongued little devil. I don't want either of you falling for him." As she chuckled, her daughters looked scandalized. Then she spoke to Ryuji again. "This is my oldest, Senate." At her introduction, the tall thin beauty with light brown hair and eyes to match bowed her head and then spoke to Ryuji. "It's nice to meet you, milord. This is my younger sister, Janet." At the introduction, the slightly shorter but much better endowed girl with dirty blonde hair in a ponytail bowed. "We are pleased to meet you, milord. I was wondering, however, if you could tell us how you plan on dealing with our business? We need to get a few more details before we could decide." Ryuji then spent the next few minutes explaining how he intended to invest up front and keep a running ledger of the store's profits. They also asked if he would let them look at the ledger, and he readily agreed. He then tore out a sheet of paper and had Lisbeth draw up the contract, citing an inability to cheat them if they wrote it. The contract was contingent on them finding a piece of storefront property that they could use and him being able to purchase it. The details were the interest rate, which if the store made a low profit would take between 30 and 60 years to pay back. Any money paid above the minimum would count towards the principal, not the interest. By the end of the hour or so he had been talking with them, they had an agreement. It would still be a while before they could act on the contract, because finding a place to set up shop might take a bit. Ryuji decided to stop by the tax office at lunch. He hurried to the magic shop and Dorn sniffed of him and got a big knowing grin on his face. He told Ryuji to be careful of drinking and trying to do magic. Ryuji grimaced at him and swore he was never going near the stuff again. Dorn laughed so hard that he started coughing. Ryuji spent the time until lunch translating another couple of pages of text. It was slow going, but he was starting to get the hang of it by the time he heard Dorn yell for him to take lunch. As he was heading out the door, Dorn couldn't resist getting in a parting shot. He told Ryuji not to have too much ale with his lunch and went back to laughing maniacally. Ryuji made his way to Lisbeth's and bought the usual butter bread before heading to the tax office. When he first arrived in front of the building, he thought the young cat girl had given him the wrong location. He looked to the side and made sure that the stable was next door to the right. The building in front of him didn't look like a business, but a home. He shrugged and went up the steps and knocked on the blue and red door. There was a moment's pause, then an answer came from inside. It was a woman's voice. "Yes? Come in, the door is open." Shrugging, he opened the door and stepped into the building. The inside was, as he had feared, set up as someone's house. He looked around the room at the ornate wooden furniture with gold inlays and at the paintings on the walls until finally, his eyes settled on the occupants of the room. At the far side, sitting in what looked like an overstuffed armchair was an older woman with long curly brown hair, wearing a long elegant gown reading a book. Standing beside the chair was a young man with short golden blonde hair wearing an odd gray suit, holding a silver tray with a drink on it. After a moment, the woman closed the book and reached up for the drink the man handed down to her. After taking a sip and replacing the drink on the tray, she turned to look in Ryuji's direction with a slight smile on her face. "My, what a handsome guest I have today. What can I do for you, my handsome elven guest?" Ryuji cleared his throat, feeling distinctly uncomfortable, and made a shallow bow before remembering that he hadn't seen anybody bowing here. "I beg that you pardon my intrusion, I may have been given the wrong directions. I was informed that this was the tax office for the duchy. If I have indeed come to the wrong place, I ask that you would indulge my ignorance, young lady. Perchance you might be able to guide me to the right location? If so, I would be ever so grateful." The woman looked as though she was about to burst out laughing, but she stifled it before replying. "There's no need to be so formal with me, my lord. I'm not of noble birth, but this is indeed the office of the tax collector, and my home as well. What might I do for you, my most eloquent elf lord?" Ryuji had to consciously stop himself from slouching in relaxation. He wanted to tell her not to treat him like nobility either, but he thought better of it and went on quickly. "I was informed that in order to procure a place of business, I would need to apply for the tax title here. I have a couple of businesses that I was hoping to see into a storefront. If possible, I was hoping to see what parcels of land were available, including a few locations for my residence." The woman seemed to think this over for a moment, then stared at Ryuji as if trying to discern his true intentions. After a moment, she shrugged and turned to the man in gray. "Garen, fetch my ledger and the city map, please." After the man left the room, she got up and made her way over to a desk in the opposite corner of the room. She sat behind it and motioned Ryuji into the seat facing her. When he got closer, he could tell that she appeared to be around her late 40s or so, but her skin didn't look worn and weathered like most of the people he had met. She had a single mole under her left eye, but otherwise, her skin looked unblemished and her hair was dark chocolate brown and well-maintained. He figured this must be a fairly cushy job if she looked like that. Moments later, the man returned with the requested items, and she wasted no time in unrolling a large map across the empty desktop. To one side, she set down the ledger and flipped about a bit before looking back at the map, then at Ryuji. "So, what kinds of businesses were you wanting to start?" "I do have a very few buildings available in the nobles district, but most obviously aren't." "Oh, no. I don't need anything in the nobles district. I was hoping to find 2 storefronts, one for a leather goods and the other for a bakery. I wouldn't mind also finding a small home, but I can wait on that. The other 2 are more important." The woman seemed quite amused. "Quite the odd pair of businesses. As it turns out though, I have the perfect spot for a bakery. The store used to be owned by a baker a number of years back, but the couple died and nobody had any use for such a specifically modified piece of property. That one is fairly cheap. I can let it go for only 12 small gold. As for the leatherware store, you have a number of options ranging in price from a small corner shop for 10 small gold to a former inn for which you would have to negotiate the price with Count Rourke himself. For now, I think I would like to reserve the bakery, and I would like to get a list of properties available that might work for my other storefront." "Oh, and can I get the places detailed on a map? I get lost easily, you see."